in the primordial darkness before creation, when chaos still reigned supreme and the ordered world of mortals remained but a distant dream, the cosmic forces that would shape Egypt's destiny began their eternal dance. Among the first deities to emerge from the primeval waters of Nun stood Geb, the embodiment of the earth itself, whose body formed the fertile ground upon which all life would flourish. Above him stretched Nut, the star-spangled goddess of the sky, her celestial form arching across the heavens like a protective canopy adorned with countless points of light. The union between these two primordial forces represented far more than mere divine romance. Geb, with his green-tinged skin that mirrored the fertile soil of the Nile Valley, possessed dominion over all terrestrial matters, the minerals buried deep within the Earth's crust, the crops that would sustain humanity, and the very ground upon which temples and cities would rise. His body, often depicted as undulating hills and valleys, bore the scars and beauty of geological ages, while his eyes held the wisdom of stones that had witnessed the birth of mountains. Nut, in stark contrast to her earthbound consort, commanded the infinite expanse above. Her dark blue skin, scattered with golden stars that formed the constellations by which sailors would navigate and priests would calculate the sacred calendar, stretched endlessly across the vault of heaven. Each evening she would swallow the sun god Ra, allowing him to journey through her body during the night hours before giving birth to him again at dawn. Her fingertips touched the eastern and western horizons, while her spine formed the celestial pathway along which the sun, moon and stars travelled their appointed courses. The passionate embrace between earth and sky, however, carried within it the seeds of cosmic disruption. Ra, the supreme solar deity whose authority governed the ordered universe, recognized that the offspring of such a union would possess unprecedented power, beings who combined terrestrial stability with celestial wisdom, creatures capable of challenging even his own supremacy. The sun god's concerns stem not from petty jealousy, but from a deep understanding of cosmic balance. Too much power concentrated in a single lineage could upset the delicate equilibrium that maintained order throughout creation. Acting with the calculated precision that characterized his rule, Ra pronounced a curse upon the pregnant Nut that would echo through eternity. The sky goddess, already swollen with 5 divine children, would be forbidden from giving birth during any of the 360 days that comprised the traditional Egyptian calendar year. This seemingly insurmountable obstacle threatened to trap the unborn deities within their mother's womb indefinitely, preventing their emergence into the world where they were destined to play crucial roles in the cosmic order. The situation demanded divine intervention of the most ingenious kind. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and divine scribe whose intelligence surpassed that of all other deities, devised a solution that would satisfy both Ra's decree and cosmic necessity. The god of wisdom challenged Khonsu, the lunar deity who controlled the phases of the moon and the passage of time itself, to a series of games of Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game that symbolized the journey through life and death. These were no ordinary gaming sessions conducted for mere entertainment. Each move of the pieces across the checkered board carried cosmic significance, with the very fabric of time hanging in the balance. Thoth's superior strategic mind gradually overcame Khonsu's defences, winning from the moon god precious fragments of lunar light, enough illumination to create 5 additional days that existed outside Ra's original calendar. These epigomenal days, as they would later be known, provided the loophole that cosmic law required. On the first of these 5 miraculous days, when the boundary between the old year and the new remained fluid and undefined, Nut finally experienced the relief of childbirth. The first to emerge from her celestial womb was Osiris, whose birth was heralded by phenomena that announced the arrival of a deity destined for greatness. The very earth trembled as Geb welcomed his eldest son, while the stars in Nut's body pulsed with unusual brilliance, creating patterns in the night sky that would be remembered and recorded by future generations of priests and astronomers. Osiris emerged bearing the unmistakable marks of his divine parentage. His skin carried the green hue of fertile earth, awakened by the annual flood, a coloration that immediately identified him with the life-giving properties of the Nile's inundation. This verdant complexion was not merely symbolic, but represented his fundamental connection to the cycles of growth, death, and renewal that governed all existence. Unlike the static green of precious malachite or the artificial pigments used in temple decorations, Osiris's skin seemed to pulse with the living energy of sprouting grain and unfurling lotus blossoms. The newborn god's physical form combined human perfection with divine authority in ways that would establish the template for royal iconography throughout Egyptian history. His limbs possessed the ideal proportions that temple artists would later codify in their canonical representations of divine and royal figures. His face, marked by the serene confidence of one born to rule, featured the strong jaw and penetrating gaze that would become synonymous with legitimate pharaonic authority. Even in infancy, certain sacred objects manifested around Osiris, materializing from the cosmic forces that recognized his destined role. The crook and flail, those quintessential symbols of royal power that every subsequent pharaoh would carry, appeared first in his tiny hands. The crook, originally a shepherd's tool for guiding wayward sheep, represented the ruler's responsibility to guide and protect his subjects with firm but gentle authority. Its curved head, carved from wood that had absorbed the essence of the tree of life, bore intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions that detailed the proper conduct of kingship. The flail, with its 3 leather strips attached to a decorated handle, symbolized the pharaoh's role as the one who separates grain from chaff, both literally in ensuring abundant harvests and metaphorically in distinguishing justice from injustice, truth from falsehood. The leather strips themselves were crafted from the hide of the celestial cow that provided sustenance to the gods, while the handle bore inlaid precious stones that corresponded to the major constellations governing Egypt's agricultural calendar. Upon Osiris's head materialized the Atef crown, a magnificent headdress that would become his most distinctive attribute. This elaborate crown combined the traditional white crown of Upper Egypt with 2 ostrich feathers representing truth and justice, flanked by ram's horns that curved gracefully downward to frame his face. The central white portion, shaped like a tall conical mitre, bore the Uraeus serpent whose hood flared in eternal vigilance against threats to the divine order. The ostrich feathers, pristine white and perfectly symmetrical, caught and reflected light in ways that created an almost hypnotic shimmer around the god's head. The ram's horns that adorned the crown carried deep symbolic significance beyond mere decoration. These curved projections connected Osiris to the creative and generative powers of Khnum, the ram-headed god who shaped human beings on his potter's wheel. They also linked him to the constellation Aries, whose appearance in the night sky coincided with the beginning of the agricultural season, when the Nile's floodwaters receded and farmers could plant their crops in the newly fertile mud. As the infant Osiris grew, his connection to the natural cycles that governed Egyptian civilization became increasingly apparent. His presence seemed to influence the very rhythm of the seasons, with his moods reflecting and perhaps even controlling the annual flood cycle that brought life to the narrow strip of fertility along the Nile's banks. When the child god smiled, witnesses reported that the river's waters began their gradual rise, carrying with them the precious silt from the Ethiopian highlands that would enrich the farmland for miles around the riverbanks. The prophetic utterances surrounding Osiris's birth came from sources both divine and mortal, weaving together into a tapestry of destiny that foretold his crucial role in establishing Egyptian civilization. The 7 Hathors, those cow-headed goddesses who determined the fate of newborns, spoke in unison as they examined the divine infant. Their voices, harmonizing like the music of the spheres, proclaimed that this child would become the greatest of all rulers, the one who would transform Egypt from a collection of scattered tribes into a unified kingdom blessed with agriculture, law, and divine order. Seshat, the goddess of writing and measurement, whose leopard skin garment was spotted with stars, recorded these prophecies in her celestial library, using hieroglyphs that pulsed with their own inner light. Her reed pen, cut from papyrus that grew in the primordial marshes where creation first began, traced symbols that would influence the course of history for millennia to come. The prophecies spoke of a ruler who would teach humanity the arts of civilization, how to cultivate grain instead of merely gathering wild plants, how to brew beer and bake bread, how to work metals and weave cloth. The divine child's association with vegetation manifested in ways that amazed even the other gods. Where his feet touched the earth, plants grew with unprecedented vigour and abundance. Barley and emmer wheat sprouted from soil that had previously been barren, their stalks growing thick and strong, their heads heavy with grain. Fruit trees that had stood leafless for seasons suddenly burst into bloom, their branches bending under the weight of dates, figs, and pomegranates that ripened with supernatural speed. This vegetative power extended beyond mere growth to encompass the entire cycle of agricultural life. Osiris seemed to understand instinctively the proper timing for planting and harvesting, the correct methods for preparing soil and storing grain, the rituals and offerings that would ensure the gods' continued blessing upon the crops. His knowledge encompassed not just the practical aspects of farming, but also the spiritual dimensions that connected agricultural work to the cosmic order. The green coloration that marked Osiris as a fertility deity carried meanings that penetrated to the very heart of Egyptian religious thought. Green represented not just the obvious connection to growing plants, but also the concept of regeneration after death, the promise that life would continue beyond the grave just as plants emerged from seeds buried in the dark earth. This colour would later become associated with resurrection and eternal life, concepts that would define Osiris's role in the afterlife and establish him as the supreme judge of the dead. The timing of Osiris's birth during the epigomenal days held significance that extended far beyond the clever solution to Ra's curse. These 5 days existed outside normal time, creating a liminal period when the boundaries between the ordered world and primordial chaos became permeable. Deities born during this interval possessed unique characteristics that set them apart from gods who emerged during the regular calendar year. They carried within themselves something of the creative potential that had existed before the establishment of cosmic order, making them agents of transformation and change. As Osiris reached maturity, the cosmic forces that had shaped his birth began to manifest in ways that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. The young god's physical development had progressed beyond the remarkable signs of his infancy, revealing a being whose very presence commanded both reverence and loyalty from mortals and deities alike. His height surpassed that of ordinary men by nearly 2 cubits, yet his proportions remained perfectly balanced according to the divine mathematics that governed sacred architecture and temple construction. The transition from divine prince to ruling pharaoh occurred through a series of events that established precedents for royal succession throughout Egyptian history. Geb, recognizing that his eldest son had attained the wisdom and power necessary to govern both the earthly and divine realms, formally abdicated his position as ruler of the terrestrial sphere. This transfer of authority took place during the annual Opet festival, when the barriers between the mortal and divine worlds grew thin enough to permit such momentous transitions. The coronation ceremony itself unfolded across multiple sacred sites, beginning at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, where the creative word of the god had first brought order from chaos. Osiris knelt before the ancient altar, while priests representing every nome of Egypt witnessed the placement of the double crown upon his head. The Shent, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt, materialized through divine intervention rather than human craftsmanship. The white portion, representing the southern kingdom's connection to the pure light of the sun, merged seamlessly with the red crown that symbolized Lower Egypt's fertile delta region and its association with the life-giving properties of blood and earth. The newly crowned pharaoh's first act established the fundamental principle that would govern Egyptian kingship for the next 3 millennia. Osiris declared himself not merely a ruler chosen by the gods, but a living deity whose authority derived directly from his divine parentage and cosmic role. This concept of divine kingship transformed the pharaoh from a powerful mortal leader into an intermediary between the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay and ensured the continued prosperity of the two lands. The marriage between Osiris and his sister Isis represented far more than a union between two individuals. Egyptian royal tradition demanded that pharaohs marry within their immediate family to preserve the purity of divine bloodlines and prevent the dilution of sacred power through mixture with mortal lineages. Isis, who had been born on the second of the 5 epigomenal days, possessed complementary abilities that made her the perfect partner for Egypt's first divine ruler. Where Osiris commanded the cycles of vegetation and the mysteries of death and resurrection, Isis wielded power over magic, healing, and the protective forces that shielded Egypt from external threats. Her knowledge of Heka, the fundamental magical force that permeated all existence, surpassed that of every other deity except Thoth himself. She could speak the secret names of gods and demons, compelling them to obey her will, and her mastery of protective spells made her the ultimate guardian of royal authority. The wedding ceremony took place during the season of Akhet, when the Nile's annual flood reached its peak and the entire country transformed into a vast inland sea, dotted with islands where temples and cities stood like jewels rising from the waters. The symbolism was deliberate and profound. Just as the flood brought renewal and fertility to the land, the union of Osiris and Isis would bring unprecedented prosperity and divine blessing to their subjects. Together, the royal couple established their capital at Memphis, strategically positioned at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, where the Nile Delta began its fan-like spread toward the Mediterranean Sea. The city's location allowed them to govern both regions effectively, while maintaining easy communication with the various administrative centres scattered throughout their domain. The royal palace, constructed according to architectural principles that Osiris himself revealed to human builders, incorporated elements that reflected both earthly grandeur and cosmic significance. The palace's central throne room featured a ceiling painted to mirror the night sky, with constellations mapped according to their positions during Osiris's birth. The walls displayed detailed reliefs depicting the agricultural cycle from planting through harvest, emphasizing the pharaoh's role in ensuring the land's continued fertility. The throne itself, carved from a single block of black granite quarried from the first cataract region, bore inscriptions in hieroglyphs that pulsed with their own inner light when Osiris sat upon it. The cultural innovations that Osiris introduced to humanity represented a revolutionary transformation from the primitive hunter-gatherer societies that had previously dominated the Nile Valley. Before his reign, humans had subsisted primarily on wild game, fish from the river, and whatever edible plants they could gather from the marshlands and desert fringes. Their settlements consisted of temporary camps that moved seasonally to follow animal migrations and take advantage of different food sources. Osiris's greatest contribution to human civilization lay in his introduction of systematic agriculture. The god personally taught selected humans how to identify the most productive strains of wild barley and emmer wheat, showing them the techniques for collecting seeds and preparing them for planting. He demonstrated the proper methods for breaking and preparing soil, explaining how the annual flood cycle could be harnessed to maximum advantage through careful timing of agricultural activities. The cultivation techniques that Osiris revealed involved far more than simply scattering seeds and hoping for favourable weather. He taught humans to construct irrigation channels and basins that could capture and retain floodwater long after the Nile had receded to its normal level. These engineering projects required coordinated labour from entire communities, fostering cooperation and social organisation on a scale previously unknown in human societies. The god's agricultural instruction included detailed knowledge of crop rotation and soil management that would prevent the exhaustion of farmland over successive growing seasons. He explained how different plants affected soil fertility, demonstrating which crops should follow others in sequence to maintain optimal growing conditions. This systematic approach to farming allowed human settlements to become permanent rather than nomadic, laying the foundation for the complex urban civilization that would characterize ancient Egypt. Beer brewing represented another crucial innovation that Osiris brought to humanity. The process began with the careful selection of barley grains that had been allowed to sprout slightly before being dried and ground into flour. This malted barley was then mixed with water and allowed to ferment using wild yeasts that Osiris taught humans to identify and cultivate. The resulting beverage provided not only nutrition and safe hydration, but also played essential roles in religious ceremonies and social bonding. The brewing process that Osiris established became deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious practice. The fermentation of grain into beer served as a metaphor for transformation and rebirth, concepts that would later become central to funerary beliefs and the promise of resurrection in the afterlife. The god taught humans to offer the first portion of each batch to the deities, establishing a pattern of reciprocal relationship between mortals and gods that would characterize Egyptian religion throughout its history. Bread-making complemented beer brewing as another fundamental innovation that transformed human nutrition and social organization. Osiris demonstrated how ground grain could be mixed with water and shaped into loaves that were baked in ovens constructed according to divine specifications. The bread that resulted from these techniques provided concentrated nutrition that could sustain larger populations and be stored for extended periods, crucial advantages for communities that could no longer rely on hunting and gathering. The religious practices that Osiris established during his reign created the foundation for the complex theological system that would govern Egyptian spiritual life for millennia. He instituted daily rituals that acknowledged the gods' role in maintaining cosmic order, while requesting their continued blessing upon the land and its people. These ceremonies involved offerings of food, drink, and incense, accompanied by specific prayers and hymns that had to be recited with precise pronunciation and timing. Temple construction began during Osiris's reign according to architectural principles that reflected the structure of the cosmos itself. The god revealed to human builders the proper orientations for sacred buildings, explaining how temples should be aligned with specific stars and constellations to maximize their effectiveness as conduits between the earthly and divine realms. The materials used in temple construction were selected for their symbolic significance, as well as their practical properties, with different stones and metals representing various aspects of divine power. The priesthood that Osiris established served multiple functions beyond their obvious religious duties. Priests became the keepers of written knowledge, responsible for maintaining records of agricultural cycles, astronomical observations, and legal precedents. They supervised the temple workshops where skilled craftsmen produced the objects necessary for religious ceremonies, from simple pottery vessels to elaborate golden statues of the gods. Having established these fundamental institutions of Egyptian civilization, Osiris felt compelled to share his knowledge with peoples beyond the borders of the two lands. His decision to embark on extensive travels throughout the known world reflected his understanding that divine wisdom should benefit all humanity, not just the inhabitants of the Nile Valley. These journeys would test both his own abilities as a teacher and diplomat and Isis's capacity to govern Egypt in his absence. The preparations for Osiris's departure required careful attention to the administrative structures that would maintain order during his absence. Isis assumed full royal authority, with her magical powers providing additional protection for the kingdom against both natural disasters and human enemies. The god appointed trusted officials to oversee specific aspects of government, from tax collection and judicial proceedings to the maintenance of irrigation systems and temple ceremonies. Before departing, Osiris established a communication system that would allow him to remain informed about conditions in Egypt, while enabling Isis to seek his counsel on particularly difficult decisions. This network relied on specially trained birds, whose intelligence had been enhanced through divine intervention, allowing them to carry complex messages across vast distances with perfect accuracy. The first destination of Osiris's civilizing mission lay in the lands immediately south of Egypt, where Nubian tribes controlled the trade routes that brought gold, ivory and exotic animals down the Nile. These peoples had observed Egyptian prosperity with growing interest, and many welcomed the opportunity to learn the agricultural and technological innovations that had transformed their northern neighbours. Osiris's approach emphasised peaceful instruction rather than conquest, demonstrating the benefits of his teachings through practical examples that local leaders could observe and evaluate for themselves. The success of Osiris's civilizing missions beyond Egypt's borders only served to amplify the bitter resentment that had been festering in the heart of his younger brother Set since their births on the epigomenal days. While Osiris travelled the known world, teaching agriculture and establishing diplomatic relations with foreign peoples, Set remained in Egypt, ostensibly serving as a loyal supporter of his brother's reign. Yet beneath this facade of fraternal cooperation, a consuming jealousy ate away at the red-haired god like acid dissolving precious metal. Set's physical appearance marked him as fundamentally different from his celebrated elder brother. Where Osiris possessed the green-tinged skin that proclaimed his connection to fertility and renewal, Set's flesh bore the ruddy coloration of desert sand heated by the merciless sun. His hair, a striking shade of red that seemed to flicker like flames in certain light, immediately identified him with the harsh, unforgiving landscapes that lay beyond the Nile's life-giving reach. His eyes, pale and unsettling, reflected the bleached bones of creatures that had perished in the wasteland's embrace. The god's association with the desert regions that bordered Egypt's fertile valley positioned him as the eternal outsider, the one who dwelt in spaces where Osiris's green magic held no sway. Set commanded the scorching winds that could destroy crops in a single afternoon, the sandstorms that buried entire settlements, and the mirages that led travellers astray until they died of thirst within sight of salvation. His domain encompassed not just the physical desert, but also the conceptual wilderness, the realm of chaos that existed beyond the ordered boundaries of civilization. Foreign lands and their peoples naturally fell under Set's influence, particularly those regions where Egyptian agricultural techniques proved ineffective and where different gods held sway over local populations. The god developed extensive networks of contacts among the desert nomads who moved seasonally between oases, the mountain tribes who controlled mineral-rich territories, and the seafaring peoples whose ships brought exotic goods from distant shores. These connections would later prove crucial in his conspiracy against Osiris. Set's resentment stemmed from more than mere sibling rivalry, though that element certainly played a significant role in his growing hatred. The fundamental issue lay in the cosmic roles that fate had assigned to each brother. Osiris embodied Ma'at, the divine principle of order, truth and justice that formed the foundation of Egyptian civilization. His every action reinforced the structures that maintained harmony between gods and mortals, between the natural world and human society, between life and death. Set, by contrast, represented Isfet, the chaotic forces that constantly threatened to overwhelm the ordered world and return creation to the primordial darkness from which it had emerged. This was not necessarily an evil role in the cosmic scheme, for chaos served essential functions in maintaining universal balance. Without the possibility of disorder, order itself would become stagnant and meaningless. Set's destructive power cleared away outdated structures to make room for new growth, just as desert winds scoured away loose sand to reveal the solid bedrock beneath. However, Set chafed against the limitations that his cosmic role imposed upon him. While Osiris received constant praise and adoration from both gods and mortals, For his contributions to civilization, Set found himself feared and avoided despite performing equally necessary functions in maintaining universal balance. The god's temples received fewer offerings, his festivals attracted smaller crowds, and his priests held lower status within the religious hierarchy that governed Egyptian society. The contrast between the brothers became most apparent during public ceremonies and state occasions. When Osiris appeared before crowds of worshippers, his presence inspired feelings of security and abundance. Farmers brought their finest produce to lay before his throne, craftsmen displayed their most skillful work for his approval, and children reached out to touch his robes in hopes of receiving his blessing. The very air seemed to shimmer with golden light when the green god smiled upon his subjects. Set's public appearances produced markedly different reactions. While people acknowledged his divine status and offered appropriate reverence, their behaviour carried undertones of anxiety and barely concealed fear. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, merchants hurried to complete their transactions and depart, and even temple priests performed their duties with nervous haste rather than the joyful devotion they displayed during Osiris's ceremonies. The psychological impact of this differential treatment gradually eroded Set's initial acceptance of his cosmic role. The god began to question why he should remain content with inspiring fear and unease while his brother basked in universal love and admiration. Set's conversations with his closest associates increasingly focused on the unfairness of their respective positions and the possibility of altering the established order to achieve a more equitable distribution of a divine authority. The specific catalyst that transformed Set's resentment from passive bitterness into active conspiracy occurred during one of Osiris's extended absences from Egypt. The green god had embarked on an ambitious journey to the distant lands beyond the Euphrates River, where he intended to establish diplomatic relations with the emerging city-states of Mesopotamia and share his agricultural innovations with their populations. The mission required careful planning and extensive preparation, as the distances involved meant that Osiris would be absent from Egypt for nearly 2 full years. During this extended period, Set assumed greater responsibilities in governing Egypt alongside Isis. The arrangement should have provided him with the recognition and authority he craved, but instead it only highlighted the differences between his approach to leadership and that of his absent brother. Where Osiris ruled through inspiration and example, Set relied on commands backed by the threat of divine punishment. Where Osiris encouraged cooperation and mutual support among his subjects, Set demanded strict obedience and immediate compliance with his directives. The results of these different leadership styles became apparent within months of Osiris's departure. Agricultural productivity declined, as farmers struggled to maintain their enthusiasm for work that no longer carried the promise of divine blessing. Temple attendance dropped, as worshippers found Set's ceremonies austere and intimidating compared to the joyful celebrations that had characterized Osiris's reign. Even the Nile's annual flood seemed less reliable, rising to levels that provided adequate but not abundant irrigation for the coming growing season. Isis worked tirelessly to compensate for these difficulties through her mastery of protective magic and her diplomatic skills in managing relationships with Egypt's various administrative districts. Her efforts prevented any serious crises from developing, but they could not disguise the fact that Egypt functioned less smoothly under Set's temporary authority than it had under Osiris's direct rule. The comparison stung Set's pride and reinforced his growing conviction that he deserved a permanent position of supreme authority, rather than the subordinate role that fate had assigned him. The god's frustration reached a breaking point when reports arrived detailing Osiris's spectacular successes in foreign lands. Mesopotamian rulers had welcomed the Egyptian god with elaborate ceremonies and rich gifts, eager to learn the agricultural techniques that had made Egypt the most prosperous nation in the known world. Osiris had established permanent temples in several major cities, staffed by Egyptian priests, who would continue teaching his methods long after his departure. Trade agreements negotiated during the mission promised to bring unprecedented wealth into Egypt's royal treasury. Most galling of all, foreign rulers had begun referring to Osiris as the greatest of all gods, the divine teacher whose wisdom surpassed that of their traditional deities. These declarations of reverence spread beyond the immediate regions of Osiris's travels, reaching the ears of rulers and peoples throughout the ancient world. Set found himself relegated to the status of a minor deity in the shadow of his brother's growing international reputation. The decision to move from passive resentment to active conspiracy required Set to overcome significant psychological and practical obstacles. Egyptian religious traditions strongly emphasized the importance of family loyalty and the sacred bonds between siblings. For a brother to plot against a brother violated fundamental principles that governed both divine and mortal behavior. Set would need to justify his actions, not only to potential co-conspirators but also to himself. The god's solution involved reframing his planned rebellion as a necessary correction of cosmic imbalance rather than a personal vendetta. Set argued that Osiris's overwhelming dominance had upset the equilibrium between order and chaos that maintained universal stability. By concentrating too much power in the hands of a single deity, the current arrangement threatened to create a stagnant system that would eventually collapse under its own weight. Set's assumption of supreme authority would restore the dynamic tension between opposing forces that kept creation vibrant and evolving. This rationalization allowed Set to approach potential allies with arguments that appealed to their own interests while presenting his cause as serving the greater good. The god's extensive contacts among foreign peoples and desert nomads provided him with a ready pool of recruits who had their own reasons for opposing Egyptian dominance in regional affairs. These groups had watched Egypt's growing prosperity with a mixture of admiration and envy, recognizing that their own peoples could never achieve similar success while remaining outside the sphere of Osiris's influence. The recruitment process required exceptional discretion, as discovery of the conspiracy would result in immediate and severe punishment for all participants. Set could not simply announce his intentions and expect volunteers to come forward. Instead, he had to identify individuals whose personal circumstances made them receptive to his message, and then gradually introduce them to increasingly detailed aspects of his plan. The god's initial approach involved seemingly casual conversations about the current state of affairs in Egypt and the broader region. Set would express mild concerns about various problems, the difficulty of maintaining order during Osiris's extended absences, the challenges of governing peoples with different customs and beliefs, the strain that rapid expansion was placing on traditional institutions. These discussions allowed him to gauge his listeners' reactions and identify those who shared his dissatisfaction with existing arrangements. Promising candidates received invitations to private gatherings where Set could present more detailed arguments about the need for change. These meetings took place in remote desert locations where the risk of discovery remained minimal and where Set's natural authority over the harsh environment reinforced his claims to leadership. The god's ability to summon sandstorms, create mirages and navigate by the stars impressed potential conspirators and demonstrated that he possessed power independent of his brother's agricultural magic. The recruitment process gradually expanded to include 72 carefully selected individuals who represented a cross-section of groups with grievances against the current order. Desert nomads contributed their knowledge of Egypt's border regions and their skills in moving undetected across difficult terrain. Foreign merchants provided information about trade routes and diplomatic relationships that could be exploited during the conspiracy's execution. Disaffected Egyptian officials offered insider knowledge of palace security procedures and administrative weaknesses. Each conspirator brought specific skills and resources that would prove essential to the plot's success. Military officers contributed tactical expertise and access to weapons and equipment. Priests from Set's temples provided religious justification for the rebellion and promised to perform the rituals necessary to legitimize the god's assumption of power. craftsmen offered to construct the specialized equipment that the conspiracy would require, working in secret workshops hidden in the desert regions beyond the reach of Osiris's supporters. The symbolic significance of the number 72 carried deep meaning within Egyptian religious and mathematical traditions. This figure represented the product of 8 and 9, numbers that held special significance in temple architecture and ritual practice. 8 symbolized renewal and regeneration, while 9 represented completion and perfection. Their multiplication suggested that Set's conspiracy aimed not merely to destroy the existing order, but to replace it with something fundamentally superior. The number also corresponded to various astronomical and calendrical calculations that governed Egyptian religious life. 72 represented the number of days required for certain stellar observations, the interval between specific ritual celebrations, and the mathematical relationships that determined the proper proportions for temple construction. By assembling exactly this number of conspirators, Set invested his rebellion with cosmic significance that elevated it above the level of mere political opportunism. The planning phase of the conspiracy required months of careful preparation as Set and his allies worked out the details of their assault on Osiris's authority. The god's extended travels provided both opportunity and challenge. While his absence made it easier to organize without detection, it also meant that the conspirators would have to wait for his return before they could strike. This delay tested the resolve of some participants, while allowing others to make increasingly elaborate preparations for the coming confrontation. The moment of Osiris's triumphant return to Egypt after his successful diplomatic missions throughout the ancient world should have marked the pinnacle of his reign as the divine pharaoh of the two lands. The god's ship appeared on the horizon during the season of Pere, when the Nile's floodwaters had receded to reveal fields of rich black silt ready for planting. Golden banners bearing the hieroglyphs of his name fluttered from the vessel's masts, while the crew chanted hymns of thanksgiving that echoed across the water to reach the crowds gathered along the riverbank. Set stood among the welcoming party at the royal harbour of Memphis, his face carefully composed in an expression of brotherly joy that concealed the murderous calculations churning beneath the surface. The red-haired god had spent the final weeks before Osiris's return making last-minute adjustments to his conspiracy, ensuring that every detail of the planned assassination had been rehearsed to perfection. His 72 co-conspirators had dispersed throughout the city, taking up positions that would allow them to respond immediately when he gave the signal to act. The reunion between the royal brothers unfolded with all the ceremonial grandeur that Egyptian protocol demanded for such occasions. Osiris descended from his ship wearing robes of finest linen, dyed with the sacred blue that symbolized the life-giving waters of the Nile. His Atef crown caught the afternoon sunlight, creating a nimbus of golden radiance around his head that reinforced his divine status in the minds of the assembled crowds. The green god's face bore the satisfied expression of one who had accomplished great works for the benefit of his people, completely unaware of the trap that awaited him. Set approached his brother with arms outstretched in the traditional gesture of familial welcome, his voice carrying across the harbour as he proclaimed his joy at Osiris's safe return. The embrace between the two gods appeared genuine to the thousands of witnesses who had gathered to observe the homecoming ceremony, but Set's hands trembled slightly as they pressed against his brother's back, knowing that this might be among the last peaceful moments they would share. The formal procession from the harbour to the royal palace followed the ancient route that wound through Memphis's most important districts, allowing the population to observe their returning pharaoh and receive his blessing. Osiris rode in a golden chariot pulled by sacred bulls whose horns had been gilded and whose hides bore painted symbols of protection and prosperity. Set walked alongside the chariot, occasionally pointing out changes that had occurred during his brother's absence, his commentary carefully designed to demonstrate his faithful stewardship of Egyptian affairs. The god's performance during this public display required exceptional self-control, as every fibre of his being burned with the desire to reveal his true intentions and confront Osiris directly. Set had spent so many months nurturing his resentment and planning his revenge that maintaining the pretense of loyalty felt almost physically painful. Yet he recognized that premature action would doom his carefully constructed conspiracy to failure, potentially resulting in his own destruction rather than his brother's downfall. The royal palace had been prepared for an elaborate celebration that would extend over several days, honouring both Osiris's return and his diplomatic achievements in foreign lands. Set had personally overseen many of the arrangements, using his authority as regent to ensure that the festivities would provide the perfect cover for his planned assassination. The god's attention to detail impressed even the most experienced palace officials, who praised his dedication to creating a worthy welcome for the returning pharaoh. The first evening's banquet took place in the Great Hall that served as the ceremonial heart of the royal residence. This vast chamber could accommodate several hundred guests, its cedarwood ceiling supported by massive columns carved to resemble lotus plants, whose capitals bloomed with stone flowers painted in brilliant colours. The walls displayed detailed reliefs depicting Osiris's civilizing missions, created by artists who had worked frantically to complete the decorations in time for his homecoming. Set had arranged the seating according to a complex protocol that placed his co-conspirators in strategic positions throughout the hall, while maintaining the appearance of traditional Egyptian court hierarchy. Foreign dignitaries occupied places of honour near the royal dais, their presence serving to emphasize Osiris's international achievements, while also providing witnesses whose testimony would legitimize whatever version of events Set chose to present after the assassination. The evening's entertainment featured performances by musicians, dancers and storytellers who had been selected for their ability to captivate the audience's attention and mask any unusual activities that might occur during the feast. Harpists played melodies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with golden light, while dancers moved with fluid grace that mimicked the motion of the Nile's waters during flood season. Professional storytellers recounted tales of divine heroism and adventure, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that held their listeners spellbound. The food served during the banquet represented the finest products of Egyptian agriculture and craftsmanship, a living demonstration of the prosperity that Osiris's reign had brought to the two lands. Servants carried in platters of roasted fowl seasoned with exotic spices from distant lands, bowls of fruits and vegetables that gleamed like jewels in the lamplight, and amphoras of wine whose vintage dated back to the early years of the god's rule. Every dish had been prepared according to recipes that honoured specific deities, transforming the meal into a form of religious observance as well as physical nourishment. Set played the role of perfect host throughout the evening's festivities, ensuring that every guest received appropriate attention while maintaining a constant stream of conversation that celebrated his brother's achievements. The god's performance was so convincing that even Isis, whose magical abilities normally allowed her to perceive deception and hidden motives, detected no trace of the malevolent intentions that lay beneath his cordial exterior. Her failure to recognize the danger would later become a source of profound guilt that haunted her throughout the dark period following her husband's murder. As the evening progressed toward its climax, Set began to display signs of increasing excitement that he attributed to joy at his brother's return and pride in the successful celebration he had organized. The god's eyes glittered with an intensity that some guests found unsettling, though none could identify the source of their unease. His laughter came more frequently and lasted longer than the occasion seemed to warrant, while his movements carried a restless energy that suggested barely contained anticipation. The crucial moment arrived as the final course was being served, and the assembled guests had reached that state of satisfied contentment that follows a truly exceptional feast. Set rose from his place at the high table and called for silence, his voice carrying easily throughout the great hall, despite the conversational buzz that had filled the chamber. The god's announcement that he had prepared a special surprise to honour his brother's homecoming drew enthusiastic applause from the audience, who expected some form of entertainment or ceremonial presentation. Instead, Set signalled to a group of servants who'd been waiting in the shadows near the hall's main entrance. These individuals, who were actually disguised members of the conspiracy, began carrying in an object that drew gasps of amazement from the assembled guests. The item they transported was a sarcophagus of unprecedented beauty and craftsmanship, its surface covered with intricate carvings and inlays that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The sarcophagus measured exactly 6 cubits in length and 2 cubits in width, dimensions that corresponded to the sacred proportions used in temple construction and divine iconography. Its base had been carved from a single block of black granite quarried from the First Cataract region, while its lid consisted of red granite that had been polished to mirror smoothness. The contrast between these two stones created a visual effect that symbolised the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, making the object appear to be a celebration of Osiris's role as pharaoh of the unified kingdom. The decorative elements that adorned the sarcophagus represented the finest work of Egypt's most skilled craftsmen, though none of the genuine artisans who had laboured on the project understood its true purpose. The exterior surfaces bore carved reliefs depicting scenes from Osiris's life and reign, from his birth during the epigomenal days through his civilizing missions in foreign lands. These images had been filled with precious metals and semi-precious stones that created a kaleidoscope of colours when the lamplight struck them from different angles. Hieroglyphic inscriptions ran in neat columns along the sarcophagus's sides, their content consisting of prayers and spells designed to ensure the occupant's successful journey through the afterlife and eventual resurrection. The scribes who had composed these texts believed they were creating protective formulas for some future royal burial, never suspecting that their words would soon be used in an act of divine murder. The irony of using resurrection spells in a plot designed to prevent resurrection was not lost on Set, who found grim satisfaction in the perverse appropriateness of the arrangement. The interior of the sarcophagus had been lined with sheets of gold that had been hammered thin and decorated with star patterns, representing the night sky through which the deceased pharaoh would travel on his journey to the afterlife. Precious stones embedded in these golden surfaces corresponded to specific constellations that held significance in Egyptian religious astronomy. The craftsmanship was so exquisite that several guests commented on the object's beauty, expressing their admiration for what they assumed was a ceremonial piece created to honour Osiris's achievements. Set's presentation of the sarcophagus began with a carefully rehearsed speech that praised his brother's accomplishments while establishing the context for what would follow. The god described the object as a masterwork created by Egypt's finest artisans, a treasure worthy of the greatest pharaoh in the nation's history. He explained that the sarcophagus had been designed according to divine measurements revealed in sacred texts, making it not merely a work of art but a religious artifact of profound significance. The trap that Set had devised relied on appealing to Osiris's vanity and his appreciation for fine craftsmanship, characteristics that the green god had displayed throughout his reign. Set proposed that the assembled guests participate in a contest to determine who among them would fit most perfectly within the magnificent sarcophagus. The winner would receive the object as a gift, along with the honour of being recognised as the individual whose divine proportions most closely matched the ideal measurements used in its construction. The suggestion initially met with nervous laughter from some guests, who found the idea of lying in a sarcophagus during a celebration somewhat macabre. However, Set's enthusiastic endorsement of the proposal, combined with the competitive spirit that characterised Egyptian court culture, gradually overcame these reservations. Several foreign dignitaries volunteered to participate, viewing the contest as an opportunity to demonstrate their worthiness to associate with Egyptian royalty. The first volunteers who attempted to fit within the sarcophagus proved either too tall or too short, too broad or too narrow, confirming Set's claim that the object had been constructed according to very specific measurements. Each failed attempt drew good-natured laughter from the audience and increased the anticipation surrounding the eventual discovery of the individual whose proportions would match the sarcophagus perfectly. Set maintained a running commentary throughout these trials, building excitement while carefully steering the proceedings toward their inevitable conclusion. When Osiris finally agreed to participate in the contest, his decision appeared to result from natural curiosity and competitive instinct, rather than any supernatural compulsion. The green god had observed the previous attempts with growing interest, making occasional comments about the precision required in the sarcophagus's construction and the skill of the craftsman who had created it. His eventual participation seemed like the logical culmination of the evening's entertainment, rather than a step into a carefully prepared trap. The moment when Osiris lowered himself into the sarcophagus created a hush of anticipation throughout the great hall. The god's body fit the interior dimensions with uncanny precision, his head resting perfectly against the curved headrest, while his feet just touched the opposite end. The golden lining seemed to embrace his form, creating the impression that the sarcophagus had indeed been created specifically for him. Murmurs of amazement rippled through the audience as they witnessed this perfect match between divine pharaoh and sacred artifact. Set's expression of delighted surprise at his brother's perfect fit masked the savage triumph that flooded through him as he realized that the most crucial phase of his conspiracy had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The god moved quickly to the sarcophagus's side, ostensibly to examine the remarkable precision of the fit, while actually positioning himself to prevent Osiris from rising. His co-conspirators throughout the hall began to shift subtly in their seats, preparing to act on their leader's signal. The assassination itself unfolded with terrifying swiftness that left the genuine guests too shocked to intervene effectively. Set's signal consisted of a seemingly casual gesture as he leaned over the sarcophagus to congratulate his brother on winning the contest. The moment his hand touched the lid, the 72 conspirators sprang into coordinated action that demonstrated the thoroughness of their planning and rehearsal. The sarcophagus lid, which had been carefully balanced to appear stable while actually being ready to fall at the slightest pressure, crashed down onto the base with a sound like thunder that echoed throughout the great hall. Osiris's startled cry was immediately muffled as the heavy granite sealed him within the stone prison that Set had prepared for him. The god's attempts to push the lid open proved futile, as its weight exceeded even his divine strength when applied from the awkward position inside the sarcophagus. The conspirators moved with practiced efficiency to secure their victim's prison, producing tools and materials that they had concealed throughout the hall in preparation for this moment. Molten lead, heated in portable furnaces that had been disguised as decorative braziers, was poured into the narrow gap between the lid and base of the sarcophagus. The liquid metal flowed into every crevice and joint, creating an airtight seal that would prevent any possibility of escape while also ensuring that Osiris would suffocate within minutes. The choice of molten lead as the sealing agent carried symbolic significance that reflected Set's desire not merely to kill his brother, but to negate his fundamental nature. Lead represented the antithesis of the precious metals associated with divine power and eternal life. Where gold symbolized the imperishable flesh of the gods and silver represented their bones, lead embodied corruption, decay, and spiritual death. By sealing Osiris within a prison of lead, Set sought to cut his brother off from the cosmic forces that sustain divine existence. The horrified guests who witnessed this act of fraternal murder found themselves paralyzed by shock and disbelief. The transformation from festive celebration to violent assassination had occurred so rapidly that many observers struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. The foreign dignitaries, unfamiliar with Egyptian court politics and religious traditions, assumed they were observing some form of elaborate ritual whose significance they failed to understand. Isis's reaction to her husband's murder provided the most heartbreaking element of the entire catastrophic scene. The goddess had been engaged in conversation with several foreign queens when Set's trap was sprung, and her attention was initially focused on maintaining diplomatic courtesy rather than observing the contest. The sound of the sarcophagus lid slamming shut drew her gaze just as the conspirators began pouring molten lead around its edges, and the sight struck her with the force of a physical blow. The goddess's scream of anguish and rage shattered the stunned silence that had fallen over the great hall, her voice carrying such pain and fury that several guests collapsed in sympathetic agony. Isis launched herself toward the sarcophagus with desperate determination, her hands glowing with magical energy as she prepared to unleash spells that would shatter the stone prison and free her beloved husband. However, Set's conspirators had anticipated this response and moved quickly to restrain her, using specially prepared nets woven with iron threads that could disrupt magical energy. The brief struggle that followed demonstrated the true extent of Set's planning and the ruthlessness of his followers. The conspirators who grappled with Isis had been equipped with amulets that provided protection against her most devastating spells, while others stood ready with additional restraints should she break free from the initial bonds. The goddess's magical power, formidable though it was, could not overcome the combined efforts of 72 determined opponents who had prepared specifically for this confrontation. Set's assumption of control over the chaotic scene revealed the political calculations that had motivated his conspiracy as much as personal jealousy. The god immediately proclaimed himself the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, claiming that Osiris's death had been divinely ordained to restore proper balance to the cosmos. He announced that the murdered god's body would be cast into the Nile as an offering to the river deity, ensuring that the life-giving waters would continue to bless Egypt under his rule. The removal of the sealed sarcophagus from the Great Hall required the coordinated efforts of dozens of conspirators, as the combined weight of the stone coffin and its divine occupant exceeded that of any normal burial container. The procession that carried Osiris's prison through the palace corridors and down to the royal harbour moved with grim purpose, while Set's supporters maintained control over the traumatized guests and prevented any organized resistance to the coup. The casting of the sarcophagus into the Nile occurred during the darkest hour before dawn, when the boundary between night and day created conditions that Set's magical practices could exploit most effectively. The god performed a ritual of binding and banishment designed to prevent Osiris's spirit from escaping the stone prison even after physical death, while his followers chanted invocations that called upon the chaotic forces of Isfet to maintain their hold over the ordered world that their victim had created. The moment when the sarcophagus struck the river's surface and disappeared beneath the dark waters marked not only the first murder in Egyptian mythology, but also the introduction of death itself into the divine realm. Until this moment, the gods had been immortal beings whose existence continued indefinitely, without the possibility of termination. Set's successful assassination of his brother shattered this fundamental assumption and demonstrated that even divine power could be overcome through sufficient cunning and determination. The cosmic implications of Osiris's death began to manifest almost immediately as the natural forces that the green god had controlled started to respond to his absence. The Nile, which had maintained its regular cycle of flooding and recession throughout his reign, began to behave erratically as the divine will that had guided its movements was suddenly removed. The river's waters started to recede beyond their normal, low-water mark, leaving irrigation channels dry and threatening the agricultural cycle upon which Egyptian civilization depended. The failure of the annual flood represented only the most obvious manifestation of the cosmic disruption that Osiris's murder had caused. Throughout Egypt, the carefully maintained balance between order and chaos began to shift as Set's chaotic nature asserted itself over the land. Crops that should have been thriving in the post-flood season instead withered and died, while granaries that had been filled during previous years of abundance mysteriously emptied as their contents turned to dust. The darkness that descended upon Egypt following Set's assumption of power was both literal and metaphorical, as the sun itself seemed to lose much of its brightness and warmth. Ra's solar bark continued its daily journey across the sky, but the light it provided appeared wan and sickly compared to the golden radiance that had blessed the land during Osiris's reign. This dimming of the solar disk reflected the cosmic mourning for the murdered god and the universe's recognition that a fundamental violation of a divine law had occurred. The period of famine and darkness that followed Osiris's assassination would test the resilience of Egyptian civilization and set the stage for the epic quest that Isis would undertake to recover her husband's body and restore the natural order that Set's rebellion had shattered. The transformation that overtook Isis in the moments following her husband's brutal murder defied every expectation of divine behaviour that had governed Egyptian religious understanding. The goddess who had stood as the embodiment of royal majesty and magical power, her golden jewellery glinting in the torchlight, and her elaborate headdress marking her status as Queen of the Gods, underwent a metamorphosis that shocked even Set's hardened conspirators into momentary silence. With movements that carried the desperate urgency of a mortal woman rather than the measured grace of a deity, Isis tore the ornate wig from her head and cast it aside, revealing her natural hair beneath. The act of removing her ceremonial headdress represented far more than a simple change of appearance. In Egyptian culture, a woman's hair held profound significance as a symbol of her life force and feminine power. For a queen to display her unbound hair in public violated strict protocols that governed royal behaviour, while for a goddess to do so suggested a fundamental disruption of cosmic order. Isis's dark tresses, freed from their elaborate braiding and golden ornaments, fell past her shoulders in wild disarray that mirrored the chaos her husband's death had introduced into the ordered universe. The goddess's hands moved with frantic determination as she grasped strands of her hair and began cutting them with a small bronze knife that materialized in her palm through divine will. Each severed lock fell to the palace floor like a black offering to grief, creating a circle of mourning around her feet. The sound of the blade slicing through hair created an eerie whisper that seemed to echo the goddess's internal anguish, while the metallic scent of the bronze mixed with the lingering aroma of the feast to create an unsettling combination that would forever mark this moment in the memories of those who witnessed it. The cutting of her hair followed ancient mourning traditions that predated even the establishment of the pharaonic dynasties, rituals that connected the goddess to the most fundamental human experiences of loss and sorrow. By engaging in these practices, Isis demonstrated that divine grief operated according to the same emotional laws that governed mortal suffering. Her actions served as a bridge between the celestial and terrestrial realms, showing that gods could experience pain with the same intensity as their human worshippers. The removal of her royal garments proceeded with equal symbolic weight, as Isis stripped away the fine linen robes that marked her status as Queen of Egypt. The elaborate dress, woven with threads of gold and silver that caught the lamplight like captured stars, pulled around her feet as she cast it aside without regard for its precious materials or sacred significance. The jewellery that had adorned her arms, throat and fingers followed the robes to the floor, creating a small treasure trove of discarded regalia that represented her rejection of worldly authority in favour of personal devotion. In place of her royal attire, Isis donned the simple, coarse garments of a common mourner. The rough-woven linen scratched against her divine skin, a physical discomfort that served as an external manifestation of her internal torment. The fabric's natural brown colour, undyed and unadorned, marked her transition from queen to widow, from goddess of power to deity of sorrow. The transformation was so complete that several foreign dignitaries who'd been present at the feast failed to recognise her when they encountered her later, mistaking the grieving goddess for a palace servant overcome by the night's traumatic events. The mourning clothes that Isis adopted carried specific ritual significance that extended beyond their symbolic value. The garments had been constructed according to traditional patterns that dated back to the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, when the distinction between divine and human mourning practices had not yet been firmly established. The loose-fitting robe allowed for the physical expressions of grief that Egyptian culture expected from bereaved women, the beating of breasts, the tearing of clothing, and the casting of dust upon the head. Set's reaction to his sister-wife's transformation revealed the calculating nature that had driven his conspiracy from its inception. Rather than showing any trace of remorse or sympathy for her suffering, the red-haired god observed Isis's grief with the detached interest of a scholar studying an interesting phenomenon. His pale eyes tracked her movements as she prepared for her quest, noting details that might prove useful in his efforts to consolidate power over Egypt. The god's complete lack of emotional response to his sister's anguish demonstrated the extent to which his jealousy and ambition had corrupted his fundamental nature. The goddess's preparations for her journey extended far beyond the adoption of mourning attire and included magical workings that would sustain her through the trials ahead. Isis possessed knowledge of spells and incantations that surpassed those of any other deity except Thoth himself, and she drew upon this vast repository of mystical wisdom to prepare protective enchantments that would shield her from the dangers she would inevitably encounter. Her magical preparations took place in the palace's private chambers, away from the eyes of Set's supporters who might attempt to interfere with her workings. The spells that Isis wove around herself during these preparations served multiple functions beyond simple protection. Certain incantations enhanced her ability to perceive magical traces and divine emanations, crucial skills for tracking the sarcophagus that contained her husband's body. Other enchantments strengthened her physical endurance and resistance to fatigue, recognizing that her quest might require extended periods of travel through difficult terrain. The goddess also prepared disguise spells that would allow her to alter her appearance when necessary, transforming her divine features into those of a mortal woman to avoid unwanted attention. The magical implements that Isis gathered for her journey reflected both her practical needs and her emotional connection to Osiris. A bronze mirror, polished to perfect reflectivity, would serve as a scrying device that could reveal distant locations and hidden truths. A collection of precious stones, each attuned to different aspects of divine power, would provide sources of magical energy when her own reserves ran low. Most importantly, she carried a small golden amulet that contained a fragment of Osiris's essence, captured during their wedding ceremony years earlier. This token would serve as both a compass pointing towards her husband's location and a source of comfort during the darkest moments of her quest. The goddess's departure from Memphis occurred during the pre-dawn hours when Set's attention was focused on consolidating his control over the government and military. Isis slipped from the palace through servants' passages that she'd learned during her years as queen, avoiding the main corridors where guards loyal to the usurper maintained their watch. Her knowledge of the palace's hidden routes and secret chambers proved invaluable during this escape, as did her ability to cloud the minds of any guards she encountered, causing them to forget her passage moments after she had passed. The first stage of Isis's quest began at the harbour where she'd witnessed her husband's sarcophagus being cast into the Nile's dark waters. The goddess knelt at the water's edge and performed divination rituals designed to reveal the direction the current had carried Osiris's stone prison. The spells required her to enter a trance state that connected her consciousness to the river's flow, allowing her to experience the sarcophagus's journey as if she were travelling alongside it. The visions that resulted from this magical working showed her glimpses of the coffin's path as it was carried northward by the Nile's inexorable current. The images that Isis perceived during her scrying revealed details that would prove crucial to her eventual success. She saw the sarcophagus tumbling through the river's depths, its weight causing it to sink below the surface while the current continued to push it downstream. The divine emanations that surrounded Osiris's body, even in death, created disturbances in the water that affected the behaviour of fish and other aquatic creatures. These supernatural signs would serve as markers that the goddess could follow, creating a trail that would lead her to her husband's final resting place. The journey down the Nile required Isis to adopt the guise of a common traveller, using her shape-shifting abilities to assume the appearance of a middle-aged woman of modest circumstances. This disguise served multiple purposes beyond simple concealment of her identity. The appearance of an ordinary mortal would allow her to question other travellers and riverbank dwellers without arousing suspicion, while her assumed age would command the respect that Egyptian society accorded to mature women. The goddess's divine beauty remained hidden beneath the illusion of weathered features and greying hair, though her eyes retained a depth and intensity that occasionally caused observers to wonder about her true nature. The goddess travelled primarily by boat, purchasing passage on merchant vessels that plied the river's trade routes between Egypt's major cities. These commercial craft provided ideal cover for her movements, while allowing her to question crew members and passengers about unusual phenomena they might have observed in the water. Isis's conversations with these fellow travellers yielded valuable information about the sarcophagus's passage, as several witnesses reported seeing strange lights beneath the river's surface or observing fish behaving in peculiar ways. The divine emanations that surrounded Osiris's body had indeed affected the natural world in ways that created a trail for his devoted wife to follow. River dolphins, normally playful creatures that delighted in racing alongside boats, had been observed swimming in tight circles above certain locations as if marking spots of particular significance. Crocodiles, the sacred animals of Sobek that usually avoided areas of heavy boat traffic, had gathered in unusual numbers at specific points along the river, their behaviour suggesting they were responding to supernatural influences beneath the water. The most significant clues came from fishermen who reported that their nets had become entangled on some massive object resting on the riverbed near the mouth of the Nile Delta. Several attempts to free these nets had failed, with the fishermen describing an underwater obstruction that seemed to be made of stone, but was too large and regularly shaped to be a natural rock formation. These reports, combined with the other signs that Isis had observed, convinced her that Osiris's sarcophagus had become lodged in the riverbed, where the Nile's flow began to slow as it approached the Mediterranean Sea. The goddess's investigation of this location revealed that the sarcophagus had indeed settled into the mud and silt of the riverbed, but her magical senses detected something far more significant than a simple underwater burial. The divine essence that surrounded her husband's body had begun to interact with the natural forces of the river delta, creating phenomena that would have profound implications for the future of Egyptian civilization. The life-giving properties that Osiris embodied even in death were beginning to manifest in the surrounding environment. The most remarkable manifestation of these divine influences took the form of a tree that had begun growing from the riverbed directly above the sarcophagus's resting place. This was no ordinary vegetation but a specimen of unprecedented size and beauty, whose roots had somehow penetrated the sealed stone coffin and made contact with Osiris's body. The tree's growth rate defied all natural laws, reaching from the river bottom to the surface in a matter of days and continuing to expand with supernatural vigour. The species of this miraculous tree corresponded to no variety known to Egyptian botanists, combining characteristics of several different plants in ways that created something entirely new. Its trunk displayed the straight columnar growth pattern of a cedar, but its bark bore the distinctive markings of a sycamore, while its leaves resembled those of the sacred Persea tree that grew in temple gardens throughout Egypt. The combination of these features created a plant that seemed to embody all the virtues that Egyptians associated with sacred vegetation. The tree's continued growth soon carried it above the water's surface, where its expanding canopy began to attract attention from travellers passing through the delta region. The unusual appearance of such a magnificent specimen in an area not previously known for large trees drew curious observers who came to marvel at what they assumed was a natural wonder. However, those with magical sensitivity could detect the supernatural forces that surrounded the growing plant, recognizing that this was no ordinary botanical phenomenon. The divine essence that flowed from Osiris's body into the tree's root system began to manifest in ways that created unmistakable signs of the god's presence. The tree's sap, when it occasionally oozed from breaks in the bark, possessed healing properties that could cure ailments and restore vitality to those who came into contact with it. The leaves, when they fell into the river, caused the water around them to shimmer with a golden light that reminded observers of the radiance that had surrounded Osiris during his lifetime. The fragrance that emanated from the tree carried scents that evoked memories of the most sacred moments in Egyptian religious experience. Some detected the aroma of frankincense and myrrh that filled temple sanctuaries during important ceremonies, while others perceived the sweet scent of lotus blossoms that bloomed in the temple pools where priests performed purification rituals. The combination of these sacred fragrances created an olfactory signature that marked the tree as something far more significant than a mere botanical curiosity. The tree's rapid growth soon attracted the attention of merchants and travellers who recognized its potential value as a source of precious wood. The timber from such an unusual specimen would command high prices in markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean, particularly if its supernatural properties could be verified and marketed to wealthy customers seeking exotic materials for their palaces and temples. Word of the remarkable tree began to spread beyond Egypt's borders, reaching the ears of foreign rulers who specialized in acquiring rare and valuable objects. The Phoenician city of Byblos, located on the coast of what would later be known as Lebanon, had established itself as a major center for the timber trade that supplied construction materials to kingdoms throughout the ancient world. The city's merchants maintained extensive networks of contacts who kept them informed about valuable trees growing in distant locations, and reports of the miraculous specimen in the Nile Delta quickly reached their attention. The potential profits from acquiring such a unique tree motivated them to organize an expedition to investigate the claims and, if possible, negotiate for the right to harvest the valuable timber. The Phoenician merchants who travelled to Egypt to examine the tree found themselves confronted with a specimen that exceeded even the most optimistic reports they had received. The plant had continued its supernatural growth during the weeks since its discovery, reaching a height that rivaled the largest cedars of Lebanon, while maintaining the perfect proportions that marked it as something beyond ordinary vegetation. The quality of its wood, as revealed by small samples taken from fallen branches, demonstrated characteristics that would make it ideal for the most demanding construction projects. The negotiations between the Phoenician merchants and the local Egyptian authorities who claimed jurisdiction over the tree proceeded according to the complex commercial protocols that governed international trade during this period. The Phoenicians offered substantial payments in gold, silver, and precious goods in exchange for the right to harvest the tree and transport it to Byblos. The Egyptian officials, recognizing the exceptional value of what they possessed, drove hard bargains that would enrich their treasuries while establishing profitable ongoing relationships with their Phoenician counterparts. The process of harvesting the tree required specialized equipment and techniques that the Phoenicians had developed during centuries of experience in the timber trade. The operation began with careful measurements and planning to ensure that the valuable wood would be preserved in the best possible condition during removal and transport. Skilled woodcutters used bronze saws and axes to fell the massive trunk, while teams of workers prepared the elaborate system of ropes, pulleys, and sledges that would be needed to move the enormous timber. The moment when the great tree crashed into the river marked the end of one phase of Isis's quest and the beginning of another. The goddess, who had been observing the harvesting operation from a concealed position among the delta's reed beds, watched with mixed emotions as the Phoenicians loaded her husband's wooden prison onto their ships. The sight of Osiris's sarcophagus being carried away from Egypt filled her with despair, but she also recognized that the tree's removal might provide new opportunities to recover his body. The Phoenician expedition's departure for Byblos forced Isis to make critical decisions about the continuation of her quest. Following the ships would require her to leave Egypt and venture into foreign lands where her divine powers might be less effective and where she would lack the network of temples and worshippers that could provide assistance in her homeland. However, the alternative of allowing Osiris's body to disappear into the distant reaches of the Mediterranean world was unthinkable for the devoted goddess. The sea voyage that carried the precious timber from the Nile Delta to the Phoenician coast presented new challenges for Isis's pursuit of her husband's remains. The goddess possessed limited experience with maritime travel, as her divine responsibilities had always focused on the terrestrial realm, rather than the watery domain that belonged to other deities. Nevertheless, her determination to recover Osiris's body overcame her uncertainty about venturing onto the open sea, and she used her magical abilities to secure passage on a merchant vessel that was following the same route as the Phoenician timber ship. The Mediterranean crossing provided Isis with opportunities to observe the behaviour of the sea itself in response to Osiris's presence aboard the distant Phoenician vessel. The divine essence that surrounded her husband's body continued to influence the natural world, even while sealed within the tree's wooden prison, creating subtle disturbances in wind and wave patterns that the goddess could detect through her magical senses. These supernatural signs served as a navigation aid that helped her maintain contact with the ship carrying her beloved, even when visual contact was impossible across the vast expanse of water. The arrival at Byblos marked the beginning of the most complex phase of Isis's quest, as she found herself in a foreign city where different gods held sway, and where her Egyptian identity might prove more hindrance than help. The Phoenician port bustled with commercial activity as merchants from throughout the known world gathered to trade in the precious goods that made Byblos wealthy and influential. The city's harbour accommodated ships from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Greek islands, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where a disguised goddess might blend in among the diverse population of traders, craftsmen, and travellers. The goddess's first priority upon reaching Byblos involved locating the tree that contained her husband's sarcophagus, and determining what use the Phoenicians intended to make of the precious timber. Her inquiries, conducted with the careful discretion that her situation demanded, revealed that the magnificent wood had already attracted the attention of the city's royal family. King Malkander and Queen Astarte had commissioned the tree's conversion into a massive pillar that would support the roof of their palace's Great Hall, a project that would showcase both their wealth and their appreciation for extraordinary craftsmanship. The transformation of the tree into an architectural element presented Isis with unprecedented challenges in her efforts to recover Osiris's body. The sarcophagus, embedded within the wood's heart, would become permanently incorporated into the palace's structure, making any attempt at removal extremely difficult and potentially dangerous. The goddess realized that she would need to devise a strategy that would allow her to gain access to the royal palace and find some way to convince the Phoenician rulers to part with their prized pillar. The solution that Isis developed required her to abandon her previous disguise as a travelling merchant and assume a new identity that would provide legitimate reasons for entering the royal household. The goddess chose to present herself as a skilled servant seeking employment in the palace, a role that would allow her to observe the pillar's installation and perhaps find opportunities to work her magic upon the wood that imprisoned her husband. The transformation from merchant to servant required careful attention to details of appearance, manner, and speech that would make her deception convincing to the Phoenician court. The months following Osiris's murder had transformed Set's initial triumph into a reign marked by growing paranoia and supernatural dread. The red-haired god's assumption of pharaonic authority had brought him the political power he'd craved, yet the cosmic disruption caused by his brother's death continued to manifest in ways that threatened the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. The Nile's erratic behavior persisted, with flood levels that fluctuated unpredictably and left vast stretches of agricultural land either parched or waterlogged. Granaries that should have sustained the population through lean seasons emptied mysteriously, their contents turning to dust or becoming infested with insects that appeared from nowhere. Set's attempts to govern Egypt according to his chaotic nature had alienated many of the officials and priests who had initially remained neutral during the succession crisis. The gods' administrative decrees often contradicted each other or changed without warning, creating confusion among the bureaucrats responsible for implementing royal policy. Temple ceremonies honouring Set attracted smaller crowds than those that had celebrated Osiris, while whispered prayers for the murdered god's return circulated among the population, despite official prohibitions against such activities. The psychological toll of maintaining his usurped position began to manifest in Set's behaviour through increasingly erratic mood swings and obsessive concerns about potential threats to his authority. The god's pale eyes, which had once reflected the bleached clarity of desert landscapes, now carried a fevered intensity that made even his closest supporters uncomfortable. His red hair, previously a striking badge of his connection to the harsh beauty of Egypt's borderlands, had begun to show premature streaks of white that aged his appearance beyond his divine years. Reports of Isis's quest to recover her husband's body reached Set through his network of informants and spies, though the details remained frustratingly incomplete. The goddess's skill at concealment and disguise had allowed her to evade the agents he had dispatched to track her movements, while her magical abilities protected her from the scrying spells that Set's priests attempted to cast in their efforts to locate her. The knowledge that his sister-wife remained free and actively working against his interests gnawed at Set's confidence and contributed to his growing sense that unseen enemies surrounded him on all sides. The god's paranoia reached new heights when reports arrived describing strange phenomena occurring in the Nile Delta region where Osiris's sarcophagus had been carried by the river's current. Fishermen spoke of underwater lights that pulsed with golden radiance, while farmers reported that crops planted near the riverbank grew with supernatural vigour despite the generally poor agricultural conditions that plagued the rest of Egypt. These signs suggested that Osiris's divine essence continued to influence the natural world even in death, a possibility that filled Set with dread about his brother's potential return. The decision to investigate these reports personally reflected Set's recognition that the situation required direct divine intervention, rather than reliance on mortal agents who might prove inadequate to the task. The god assembled a small expedition consisting of his most trusted supporters, individuals whose loyalty had been tested during the conspiracy that brought him to power, and whose discretion could be relied upon to keep sensitive information from spreading to potential enemies. The group's composition included military officers skilled in desert warfare, priests trained in the magical arts that Set's chaotic nature required, and craftsmen capable of handling whatever physical challenges they might encounter. The journey to the Delta region took place during the season when the Nile's waters had receded to their lowest levels, exposing mudflats and sandbars that were normally hidden beneath the river's surface. Set's expedition travelled by boat during the day, following the main channel while observing the surrounding landscape for signs of the supernatural activity that had been reported by local inhabitants. The god's divine senses allowed him to detect magical emanations that would be invisible to mortal perception, and he gradually became aware of a concentration of power emanating from a specific location near the river's mouth. The source of these magical disturbances proved to be the site where the great tree had grown above Osiris's submerged sarcophagus, though the Phoenician merchants had long since harvested the valuable timber and transported it to their distant homeland. The stump that remained, still rooted in the riverbed's mud, continued to pulse with the divine energy that had fueled the tree's supernatural growth. Set's examination of this remnant revealed traces of his brother's essence that had somehow escaped the sealed stone prison and begun to influence the surrounding environment, The discovery that Osiris's power continued to manifest despite his apparent death filled Set with a rage that transcended ordinary anger and approached the fury of natural disasters. The god's emotional state began to affect the local weather patterns, causing winds to shift unpredictably and creating dust devils that danced across the exposed riverbed with unnatural persistence. His supporters watched nervously as their leader's control over his chaotic nature began to slip, recognizing that an unrestrained outburst of divine wrath could endanger everyone in the vicinity. Set's investigation of the tree stump and its surroundings revealed additional evidence that confirmed his worst fears about his brother's continuing influence. The root system that had penetrated the sarcophagus had created channels through which Osiris's essence could flow into the broader environment, establishing connections that might eventually allow the murdered god to reconstitute his physical form. The implications of this discovery were staggering, as they suggested that Set's carefully planned assassination had failed to achieve its ultimate objective of permanently eliminating his rival. The god's response to this revelation demonstrated both his cunning intelligence and his capacity for methodical cruelty. Rather than simply destroying the remaining traces of his brother's influence, Set began to formulate a more comprehensive solution that would address the fundamental problem of Osiris's persistent vitality. The murdered god's ability to affect the natural world from within his stone prison suggested that his divine essence remained intact and concentrated, creating a potential focal point for resurrection that Isis or other allies might eventually exploit. Set's solution involved a strategy that would disperse Osiris's essence so widely that no single location could serve as a centre for his brother's restoration. The god would need to recover the sarcophagus from wherever the Phoenicians had taken it, extract his brother's body, and then scatter the remains across such a vast area that reassembly would become virtually impossible. The plan's success would require careful timing and extensive preparation, but Set recognized that anything less than complete dispersal would leave him vulnerable to future challenges to his authority. The expedition's return to Memphis marked the beginning of an intensive intelligence-gathering operation designed to locate the sarcophagus and determine what use the Phoenicians had made of the precious timber. Set's agents in foreign ports began making discreet inquiries about unusual wood imports, while his diplomatic representatives opened negotiations with Phoenician merchants who might have information about the tree's ultimate destination. The god's network of informants gradually assembled a picture of the timber's journey from the Nile Delta to the royal palace at Byblos, where it had been incorporated into the building's architectural structure. The confirmation that Osiris's sarcophagus had become part of a Phoenician royal residence presented Set with complex logistical challenges that would require careful diplomatic maneuvering to resolve. Direct military action against Byblos would risk provoking a wider conflict with the Phoenician city-states and their allies, potentially destabilizing the entire eastern Mediterranean region in ways that could threaten Egypt's own security. The god needed to devise an approach that would allow him to recover his brother's body without triggering international complications that might undermine his domestic authority. Set's solution involved the dispatch of a carefully selected diplomatic mission to Byblos, ostensibly for the purpose of negotiating new trade agreements that would benefit both kingdoms. The delegation's official memorandum mandate focused on securing access to Phoenician timber and metalwork that Egypt required for its construction projects, while its secret objective involved locating the pillar that contained Osiris's sarcophagus and finding some way to extract the body without alerting the Phoenician authorities to the true purpose of their visit. The diplomatic mission's composition reflected Set's understanding that success would require a combination of negotiating skill, magical ability, and physical capability. The delegation's leader was a veteran administrator whose experience in foreign courts had taught him the subtle arts of international diplomacy, while other members included priests capable of detecting and manipulating magical emanations, craftsmen skilled in working with wood and stone, and guards trained in covert operations that might become necessary if diplomatic solutions proved inadequate. The mission's arrival at Byblos coincided with a period of celebration in the Phoenician city, as King Malkander and Queen Astarte were hosting a festival that honoured their patron deities and showcased the prosperity that successful trade had brought to their realm. The Egyptian delegation's participation in these festivities provided opportunities to observe the royal palace's interior and identify the location of the pillar that had been carved from the miraculous tree. The column's position in the Great Hall's central area made it clearly visible to visitors, though its incorporation into the building's structural framework would make removal extremely difficult. The pillar's appearance confirmed that the Phoenician craftsmen had created a masterwork that showcased both their technical skill and their appreciation for the wood's extraordinary beauty. The column's surface had been polished to a lustrous finish that revealed the intricate grain patterns running through the timber, while decorative carvings added during the shaping process enhanced its visual impact without compromising its structural integrity. The overall effect created an architectural element that dominated the Great Hall's interior and served as a focal point for the royal court's ceremonial activities. Set's agents within the diplomatic mission used their magical abilities to examine the pillar more closely, confirming that Osiris's sarcophagus remained embedded within the wood's core, and that the murdered god's essence continued to emanate from this hidden location. The divine energy that flowed through the timber had begun to influence the palace's atmosphere in subtle ways that the Phoenician inhabitants attributed to their god's blessing upon the royal household. The pillar's presence seemed to enhance the prosperity and harmony that characterized King Malkander's reign, creating conditions that made the rulers reluctant to consider any modifications to their prized architectural feature. The diplomatic negotiations that followed required exceptional subtlety as Set's representatives attempted to find some pretext for requesting access to the pillar without revealing their true intentions. Their initial approaches focused on expressing admiration for the Phoenician craftsman's skill and suggesting that Egyptian artisans might benefit from studying their techniques. These overtures met with polite responses, but failed to generate the kind of enthusiasm that would lead to meaningful cooperation, as the Phoenicians recognized the value of maintaining their technological advantages over potential competitors. The breakthrough that Set's mission required came through careful observation of Queen Astarte's personal interests and the development of a strategy that appealed to her specific concerns. The Queen had recently given birth to a son whose health had been causing anxiety among the royal family, as the infant displayed symptoms that the court physicians found difficult to diagnose and treat. The child's condition created an opportunity for Set's agents to demonstrate their medical knowledge and potentially gain the trust that would provide access to the palace's inner chambers. The Egyptian delegation's physician, who possessed both conventional medical training and knowledge of magical healing techniques, offered to examine the royal infant and provide treatment recommendations based on Egyptian therapeutic practices. This proposal appealed to Queen Astarte's maternal instincts, while also satisfying King Malkander's desire to explore every possible avenue for ensuring his heir's well-being. The arrangement that resulted from these negotiations provided Set's agents with regular access to the palace's private quarters and opportunities to conduct more detailed examinations of the pillar's magical properties. The medical treatments that the Egyptian physician provided for the royal infant proved remarkably effective, as his combination of herbal remedies and magical interventions addressed the underlying causes of the child's ailments. The success of these therapeutic efforts earned the delegation significant gratitude from the Phoenician royal family and created the kind of personal relationship that Set's agents needed to advance their secret mission. Queen Astarte's growing trust in the Egyptian physician opened doors that formal diplomatic protocols might never have unlocked. The opportunity that Set's mission had been waiting for arrived when structural problems in another part of the palace required extensive renovation work that would temporarily disrupt the Great Hall's normal activities. The construction project provided perfect cover for the kind of detailed examination that would be necessary to extract Osiris's sarcophagus from within the pillar without damaging the surrounding wood or alerting the Phoenicians to what was taking place. Set's craftsmen volunteered to assist with the renovation work, using their expertise to gain access to the pillar, while ostensibly helping to protect it from construction-related damage. The extraction process that followed required exceptional skill and magical intervention, as the sarcophagus had become thoroughly integrated with the tree's growth patterns during the period when Osiris's essence had flowed through the root system. Set's agents worked primarily during nighttime hours when the palace's normal activities were suspended, using specialized tools and techniques to carefully separate the stone coffin from the surrounding timber. The operation proceeded slowly and methodically, with frequent pauses to ensure that no traces of their activity would be visible to casual observation. The moment when Osiris's sarcophagus finally emerged from its wooden prison marked the culmination of months of careful planning and patient execution. The stone coffin appeared exactly as it had when Set's conspirators had sealed it with molten lead, though the divine emanations that surrounded it had grown stronger during the period of its concealment. The lead seals remained intact, confirming that the murdered god's body had not escaped from its stone prison despite the supernatural phenomena that had occurred around the burial site. Set's personal arrival at Byblos to oversee the final stages of the operation reflected his recognition that the critical phase of his plan required direct divine supervision. The god travelled in disguise, adopting the appearance of a wealthy Egyptian merchant whose business interests provided legitimate reasons for visiting the Phoenician port. His presence allowed him to examine the recovered sarcophagus and confirm that the extraction had been successful, while also ensuring that the next phase of his strategy could proceed according to his precise specifications. The transportation of the sarcophagus from Byblos back to Egypt required elaborate precautions to prevent discovery by Isis or other potential enemies who might attempt to interfere with Set's plans. The stone coffin was concealed within a specially constructed shipping container that disguised its true contents while providing the magical shielding necessary to contain Osiris's divine emanations. The container's exterior bore markings that identified it as containing valuable but mundane trade goods, allowing it to pass through customs inspections without attracting unwanted attention. The return journey to Egypt took place during the season when prevailing winds favoured eastbound travel across the Mediterranean, reducing the voyage's duration and minimising the time during which the sarcophagus might be vulnerable to magical detection or physical interception. Set's agents maintained constant vigilance throughout the crossing, using protective spells and physical security measures to ensure that their precious cargo remained secure until it could reach the safety of Egyptian territory. The sarcophagus's arrival at a secluded harbour in the Nile Delta marked the beginning of the most crucial phase of Set's comprehensive strategy to eliminate his brother's threat permanently. The god had spent the months during his agent's absence preparing a remote location in the desert where he could conduct the grisly work of dismembering Osiris's body without risk of interruption or discovery. The site he had selected lay far from any settled areas, in a region where the harsh environment would discourage casual travellers while providing the kind of desolate landscape that suited Set's chaotic nature. The desert location that Set had chosen for his brother's final destruction occupied a position at the intersection of several ancient trade routes, though these pathways had fallen into disuse as political changes had shifted commercial traffic to other corridors. The site's remoteness ensured privacy, while its accessibility to multiple routes would facilitate the wide distribution of body parts that Set's plan required. The god had established a temporary camp at this location, complete with the tools and materials necessary for the dismemberment process and the magical preparations that would prevent Osiris's essence from reconstituting itself. The night when Set finally broke open his brother's sarcophagus carried significance that extended far beyond the immediate act of violence he was about to commit. The timing had been calculated to coincide with specific astronomical conditions that would maximize the effectiveness of the dispersal ritual, while minimizing the risk that Osiris's scattered remains might somehow find their way back together. The moon was dark, eliminating the gentle light that had always been associated with renewal and resurrection, while certain constellations occupied positions that favoured destructive rather than creative magical workings. Set's examination of his brother's preserved corpse revealed that the divine essence that had sustained Osiris's influence over the natural world remained concentrated within the physical remains despite months of separation from the living world. The body showed no signs of the decay that would have affected mortal flesh under similar circumstances, while the green coloration that had marked Osiris as a fertility deity had actually intensified during the period of his entombment. The sight of his brother's unchanged appearance filled Set with renewed determination to complete the destruction that his original assassination had failed to achieve. The dismemberment process that followed demonstrated Set's methodical approach to eliminating every trace of his brother's potential for resurrection. Using blades that had been forged specifically for this purpose and consecrated through rituals that enhanced their ability to sever divine essence as well as physical matter, Set began the systematic division of Osiris's body into 14 separate pieces. Each cut was planned to separate specific aspects of his brother's divine nature, ensuring that no single fragment would retain enough power to serve as a focal point for reconstitution. The god's selection of 14 as the number of pieces reflected complex symbolic considerations that connected the dismemberment to fundamental principles of Egyptian religious thought. 14 represented twice 7, a number that held special significance in lunar calculations and magical practice. The division also corresponded to the number of administrative districts that comprised Upper Egypt, suggesting that Set intended to scatter the pieces throughout his kingdom in a pattern that would bind Osiris's remains to the land itself, while preventing their reunion. The specific body parts that Set created through his systematic dismemberment each carried distinct symbolic meanings that reflected different aspects of Osiris's divine nature and earthly responsibilities. The head, containing the seat of consciousness and divine wisdom, was separated first and prepared for transport to the southernmost reaches of Egypt near the first cataract. The hands, which had wielded the crook and flail of pharaonic authority, would be scattered in opposite directions to prevent them from ever again grasping the symbols of royal power. The heart, considered by Egyptians to be the centre of thought and emotion, as well as physical life, received special attention during the dismemberment process. Set recognized that this organ represented the core of his brother's identity and his capacity for moral judgment, qualities that had made Osiris beloved by gods and mortals alike. The careful removal and preparation of the heart for separate disposal reflected Set's understanding that destroying this particular piece would be crucial to preventing any possibility of his brother's return to life. The reproductive organs that had made Osiris a symbol of fertility and regeneration were treated with particular violence, as Set's jealousy extended to his brother's role as a creator of life. The god's mutilation of these body parts went beyond the practical requirements of dismemberment to become an expression of his deep resentment toward the natural processes that Osiris had embodied. The destruction of his brother's capacity for generation represented an attempt to sever the connections between divine power and the cycles of birth, growth, and renewal that sustained Egyptian civilization. The limbs and torso that remained after the removal of the more symbolically significant organs were divided according to a pattern that would maximize the difficulty of eventual reassembly. Set's knowledge of anatomy, both divine and mortal, allowed him to make cuts that would prevent the pieces from fitting together naturally, even if they were somehow recovered and brought to the same location. The god's methodical approach ensured that each fragment would require extensive magical intervention to restore its connection to the whole, a process that would demand resources and knowledge that he hoped no one possessed. The preservation techniques that Set applied to each body part before beginning their distribution reflected his determination to prevent natural decay from eliminating the evidence of his crime, while also ensuring that the pieces would remain recognizable to anyone who might eventually discover them. The god used a combination of natron salt, aromatic resins, and magical preservatives that would maintain the flesh's integrity indefinitely while preventing the divine essence from dissipating into the surrounding environment. The scattering of Osiris's remains throughout Egypt began immediately after the dismemberment was complete, with Set personally overseeing the transportation of the most significant pieces to their designated locations. The god's choice of burial sites reflected both practical considerations about concealment and symbolic meanings related to the geography of Egyptian religious belief. Each location was selected to represent a different aspect of the land's sacred geography, while also ensuring that the pieces would be separated by distances that would make accidental discovery virtually impossible. The head was carried to the region near Elephantine Island at the First Cataract, where the Nile's power was most dramatically displayed in the rushing waters that marked Egypt's southern boundary. The site's association with the river's source made it symbolically appropriate for containing the seat of Osiris's consciousness, while the area's remoteness and difficult terrain would discourage casual exploration. Set buried the head beneath a massive granite boulder that would require supernatural strength to move, adding an additional layer of protection against discovery. The heart's burial location was chosen with equal care, as Set recognized that this organ represented the greatest potential threat to his security if it were ever recovered and restored to Osiris's reconstituted body. The god selected a site in the western desert where shifting sand dunes would constantly change the landscape's appearance, making it virtually impossible for anyone to relocate the burial spot, even if they possessed general knowledge of its location. The heart was placed within a specially constructed container that would protect it from the desert's harsh conditions, while also shielding its divine emanations from magical detection. The hands that had once wielded pharaonic authority were separated and buried at opposite ends of Egypt, with one placed near the Mediterranean coast and the other in the desert regions that bordered Nubia. This geographical separation ensured that even if one hand were discovered, the other would remain hidden at a location hundreds of miles away. The burial sites were marked only by subtle magical signatures that Set himself could detect, creating a system that would allow him to verify the remains' continued security without providing clues that others might follow. The news of Osiris's dismemberment reached Isis through supernatural channels that transcended ordinary communication methods. The goddess had been serving in King Malkander's palace at Byblos, tending to the royal infant while maintaining her vigil over the pillar that contained her husband's sarcophagus, when a sudden spiritual rupture tore through her consciousness like a blade through silk. The sensation struck her during the quiet hours before dawn as she sat beside the sleeping prince's cradle, her divine senses attuned to the subtle emanations that flowed from the wooden column in the great hall below. The psychic shock that accompanied Set's systematic destruction of Osiris's body manifested as physical pain that drove the goddess to her knees on the chamber's cold stone floor. Each cut that her brother-in-law made through divine flesh registered in her own being as a corresponding wound to her soul, creating a sympathetic agony that no mortal frame could have endured. The 14 separate violations of her husband's corpse left 14 distinct scars across her consciousness, invisible marks that would serve as both torment and guide in the quest that lay ahead. Isis understood immediately that her careful infiltration of the Phoenician court had been rendered meaningless by Set's successful theft of the sarcophagus. The pillar that had dominated the palace's great hall still stood in its appointed place, its polished surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through high windows, but the divine essence that had once pulsed within its wooden heart had vanished completely. The goddess's magical examination confirmed her worst fears. The tree's hollow core bore traces of recent disturbance, while the faint residual emanations that lingered in the surrounding timber carried the unmistakable signature of violent separation. The decision to abandon her position in the Phoenician royal household required careful consideration of the diplomatic complications that her sudden departure might create. Queen Astarte had grown genuinely fond of the mysterious Egyptian woman who had helped heal her son, while King Malkander valued the medical knowledge that Isis had shared with his court physicians. The goddess recognized that an abrupt disappearance would raise questions and potentially damage the relationships that Egypt needed to maintain with the Phoenician city-states. Yet the urgency of her husband's situation left no time for gradual withdrawal. Isis resolved the dilemma through a carefully constructed deception that would explain her departure while protecting both her true identity and Egypt's diplomatic interests. She approached Queen Astarte with a fabricated story about receiving urgent news of her elderly father's declining health, claiming that family obligations required her immediate return to Egypt despite her reluctance to leave the royal service. The tale carried enough emotional authenticity to satisfy the Queen's curiosity, while providing a socially acceptable reason for the sudden termination of her employment. The farewell ceremony that Queen Astarte organised to honour the departing servant demonstrated the genuine affection that the royal family had developed for their mysterious Egyptian attendant. The Queen presented Isis with gifts that included fine jewellery, expensive fabrics, and a purse of gold coins that would have represented substantial wealth to any genuine servant. More significantly, she offered letters of introduction to Egyptian officials and merchants who might provide assistance during the journey home, documents that would prove invaluable in maintaining the goddess's mortal disguise during the trials ahead. The voyage from Byblos back to Egypt took place aboard a Phoenician trading vessel whose captain had been recommended by King Malkander's harbour master as reliable and discreet. The ship's cargo holds contained the usual mixture of goods that flowed between the eastern Mediterranean ports: cedar timber for construction projects, purple dye extracted from murex shells, metalwork crafted by skilled Phoenician artisans, and amphoras of wine from the terraced vineyards that covered the Lebanese mountains. The commercial nature of the voyage provided perfect cover for Isis's return journey, while allowing her to blend anonymously among the merchants and craftsmen who comprised the passenger manifest. The goddess used the sea crossing to prepare for the monumental task that awaited her in Egypt, through intensive magical workings that would enhance her ability to locate and recover her husband's scattered remains. The ship's constant motion and the isolation of the open water created ideal conditions for the kind of deep meditation that allowed her to extend her consciousness across vast distances and perceive the subtle emanations that marked the locations where Osiris's body parts had been hidden. The process required her to enter trance states that left her physical form vulnerable, necessitating careful timing to avoid detection by curious fellow passengers. The visions that emerged from these magical sessions revealed the scope of Set's methodical cruelty in distributing his brother's remains across the entire expanse of Egyptian territory. Isis perceived 14 distinct points of divine radiance scattered from the Mediterranean coast to the regions beyond the First Cataract, each one marking a burial site where a piece of Osiris's body lay concealed beneath sand, stone, or water. The pattern of distribution showed clear evidence of deliberate planning, with the most significant organs placed at locations that would be particularly difficult to reach or search effectively. The goddess's supernatural perception allowed her to identify not only the general locations of the burial sites, but also the specific challenges that recovering each piece would present. Some fragments lay buried in the shifting sands of the western desert, where the constantly changing landscape would make precise navigation nearly impossible for ordinary searchers. Others had been hidden in underwater locations along the Nile's course, requiring diving techniques and magical protection against the river's dangerous currents and predatory inhabitants. The most disturbing discovery that emerged from Isis's scrying involved the realization that Set had not merely scattered the body parts, but had also implemented magical barriers designed to prevent their detection and recovery. Each burial site was protected by spells that would confuse the senses of anyone attempting to locate the hidden remains, creating illusions and misdirections that would lead searchers away from their objectives. The barriers showed evidence of sophisticated magical theory that suggested Set had consulted with powerful sorcerers, or perhaps even divine allies, in crafting his protective measures. The ship's arrival at the Egyptian port of Tanis in the eastern Nile Delta marked the beginning of Isis's transformation from disguised servant back into the grieving goddess whose quest had become legend throughout the two lands. The harbour bustled with the usual commercial activity that characterised Egypt's major ports, but the goddess's enhanced senses detected an underlying atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that reflected the kingdom's deteriorating condition under Set's chaotic rule. Merchants spoke in hushed tones about crop failures and strange weather patterns, while dock workers moved with the nervous efficiency of people who feared attracting unwanted attention from the authorities. Isis's first priority upon reaching Egyptian soil involved establishing contact with her sister Nephthys, whose assistance would prove crucial in the massive undertaking of locating and recovering 14 separate body parts scattered across hundreds of miles of diverse terrain. Nephthys possessed complementary magical abilities that would enhance their combined searching power, while her knowledge of Set's psychology and methods would provide valuable insights into the specific challenges they would face at each burial site. The reunion between the two goddesses took place at an abandoned temple complex in the Delta marshlands, a location that provided both privacy and access to the magical energies that flowed through Egypt's sacred waterways. Nephthys had been living in self-imposed exile since her husband's usurpation of the throne, unable to openly oppose his actions, while simultaneously refusing to participate in the corruption of Maat that his reign represented. The goddess's appearance showed the strain of her conflicted position, with her normally immaculate divine beauty marred by signs of grief and internal struggle. The embrace between the sisters carried emotional weight that transcended their personal relationship and extended to the cosmic principles they represented. Isis embodied the protective magic that shielded Egypt from external threats and internal chaos, while Nephthys commanded the transitional forces that governed the boundaries between life and death, order and disorder. Their alliance created a combination of powers that would be essential for overcoming the obstacles that Set had placed in their path and restoring the natural balance that his actions had disrupted. Nephthys's account of conditions in Egypt during Isis's absence painted a disturbing picture of accelerating decline that threatened to undermine the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. The agricultural system that Osiris had established was failing as the Nile's behaviour became increasingly erratic, with flood levels that varied dramatically from year to year and growing seasons that no longer followed predictable patterns. The administrative structure that had governed the two lands was fragmenting as local officials struggled to implement contradictory directives from Set's chaotic court, while the priesthood faced growing pressure to abandon traditional practices in favour of rituals that honoured the usurper's authority. The magical reconnaissance that the two goddesses conducted from their marshland sanctuary confirmed the locations that Isis had perceived during her sea voyage, while revealing additional details about the specific challenges that each recovery mission would present. The burial sites formed a complex pattern across Egypt's sacred geography, with certain pieces hidden at locations that corresponded to important religious centres, while others lay concealed in remote wilderness areas that had never been touched by human settlement. The head, containing Osiris's consciousness and divine wisdom, had been buried near Elephantine Island at the First Cataract, where the granite bedrock and rushing waters would make excavation extremely difficult. The heart, representing the core of his identity and capacity for judgment, lay hidden somewhere in the western desert's trackless wastes, protected by shifting sand dunes and magical barriers that would confuse both conventional navigation and supernatural detection. The hands that had wielded pharaonic authority were separated by the entire length of Egypt, with one buried in the delta's marshlands and the other concealed in the rocky highlands near the Red Sea coast. The systematic approach that Isis and Nephthys developed for their recovery mission reflected both the magnitude of their task and the limited time available before Set's continued rule caused irreparable damage to Egyptian civilization. They divided their responsibilities according to their complementary abilities, with Isis focusing on the pieces that required her protective magic and healing knowledge, while Nephthys concentrated on those that lay in the transitional zones between life and death, where her specialized powers would prove most effective. The first recovery mission targeted the piece that lay closest to their marshland base, one of Osiris's hands, which Set had buried in a reed bed near the ancient city of Buto. The location's significance extended beyond its proximity to their sanctuary, as Buto had served as one of the earliest centres of pharaonic authority in Lower Egypt, and contained temples dedicated to the cobra goddess Wadjet, whose protective power would complement their magical workings. The burial site itself lay beneath the foundations of a ruined shrine that had been abandoned during the political upheavals following Set's coup. The excavation process required careful attention to both physical and magical considerations, as the goddesses needed to avoid detection by Set's agents, while also overcoming the protective spells that surrounded the buried remains. Isis employed divination techniques to pinpoint the exact location of the hand within the shrine's rubble-filled interior, while Nephthys prepared counterspells designed to neutralize the barriers that Set had established around his brother's remains. The work proceeded slowly and methodically, with frequent pauses to ensure that their magical activities did not create emanations that might alert hostile observers to their presence. The moment when Isis's fingers finally touched the preserved flesh of her husband's hand created an emotional and spiritual connection that transcended the physical contact itself. The divine essence that still resided within the severed limb responded to her touch with a surge of recognition that confirmed both Osiris's continued existence and his awareness of her quest to restore him. The hand's flesh showed no signs of decay despite its separation from the body, while the green coloration that marked Osiris as a fertility deity had actually intensified during the period of its burial. The careful wrapping of the recovered hand in linen treated with preservative resins and protective spells represented the beginning of the mummification process that would eventually reunite all 14 pieces of Osiris's dismembered form. Isis had studied the techniques that mortuary priests used to prepare human bodies for burial, but the requirements for preserving divine remains demanded modifications and enhancements that drew upon her deepest knowledge of magical theory. Each wrap of linen was inscribed with hieroglyphs that would maintain the hand's integrity, while also preparing it for eventual reintegration with the complete body. The success of their first recovery mission provided both encouragement and valuable intelligence about the methods they would need to employ at the remaining burial sites. The protective spells that Set had placed around the hand proved to be sophisticated but not impregnable, suggesting that similar barriers at other locations could be overcome through patient effort and careful magical preparation. However, the experience also revealed that each recovery would require substantial time and energy, resources that would become increasingly precious as their quest continued. The second piece they sought lay in the opposite direction from their base, buried in the limestone cliffs that bordered the Nile Valley near the ancient city of Dendera. This location held special significance as the site of a major temple complex dedicated to Hathor, the cow goddess whose maternal aspects made her a natural ally in their efforts to restore life to the murdered god. The burial site itself occupied a cave system that had been used for religious purposes since the earliest periods of Egyptian history, its chambers decorated with primitive paintings that depicted the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The journey to Dendera required the goddesses to travel through territory that was increasingly under Set's direct control, necessitating enhanced disguise spells and careful attention to avoiding the patrol routes that his agents followed in their efforts to monitor movement throughout the kingdom. Isis and Nephthys adopted the appearance of travelling merchants specialising in the kind of religious artefacts and temple supplies that would provide legitimate reasons for visiting sacred sites throughout Egypt. Their disguised forms carried the subtle marks of middle age and modest prosperity that would make them unremarkable to casual observers, while commanding enough respect to avoid unwanted harassment. The cave complex at Dendera presented unique challenges that differed significantly from those they had encountered during their first recovery mission. The limestone formations created natural acoustic properties that amplified sound in unpredictable ways, making stealth extremely difficult while also providing opportunities for magical workings that relied on sonic resonance. The ancient paintings that decorated the chamber walls contained protective symbols that had been activated by Set's burial ritual, creating a layered defense system that would require careful analysis before they could safely proceed with their excavation efforts. Nephthys' specialized knowledge of transitional magic proved crucial in overcoming the cave's defenses, as her understanding of the boundaries between different states of existence allowed her to identify the specific points where Set's barriers could be safely penetrated. The goddess worked methodically through the protective layers, using techniques that turned the cave's own ancient magic against the newer spells that the usurper had imposed upon the site. The process required several days of patient effort, during which the sisters maintained constant vigilance against the possibility of discovery by hostile forces. The piece of Osiris's body that they recovered from the Dendera cave proved to be a section of his torso that contained vital organs associated with the digestive processes that transformed food into life-sustaining energy. The symbolic significance of this recovery at Hathor's sacred site was not lost on either goddess, as the cow deity's role in nourishing both gods and mortals made her temple complex and appropriate location for finding the organs that had sustained Osiris's physical existence. The preservation of this body part showed the same supernatural integrity that had characterized their first recovery, confirming that Set's dismemberment had not succeeded in destroying his brother's essential divine nature. The recovery of Osiris's scattered remains had consumed months of dangerous searching across Egypt's vast expanse, with Isis and Nephthys working methodically to locate each of the 14 pieces that Set had hidden throughout the kingdom. Their quest had taken them from the granite quarries of Aswan to the salt marshes of the Mediterranean coast, through desert wadis where ancient caravan routes crossed and into underground chambers where the earliest pharaohs had been entombed. Each successful recovery had required weeks of preparation, magical reconnaissance, and careful excavation work that left both goddesses physically and spiritually drained from their efforts. The reassembly of Osiris's dismembered form had taken place in a secret sanctuary that Isis had established in the remote marshlands of Chemis, a location chosen for its isolation from Set's agents and its connection to the primordial waters from which all life had emerged. The site occupied a small island surrounded by papyrus thickets and reed beds that provided natural concealment while also offering access to the magical energies that flowed through Egypt's sacred waterways. Ancient temple foundations dating back to the earliest dynasties lay partially submerged beneath the marsh waters, their weathered stones bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions that invoked the protective power of the cobra goddess Wadjet. The mummification process that Isis had performed upon her husband's restored corpse represented the culmination of mortuary techniques that had been developing since the beginning of Egyptian civilization, enhanced by divine knowledge that no mortal embalmer could possess. The goddess had wrapped each reassembled limb with linen strips that had been soaked in resins imported from the distant lands of Punt, their aromatic properties serving both practical preservation functions and spiritual purposes that would facilitate Osiris's eventual resurrection. The bandages themselves bore hieroglyphic spells, written in golden ink that pulsed with their own inner light, creating a network of protective enchantments that surrounded the god's reconstructed form. The completed mummy lay upon a bier carved from a single block of black granite that had been quarried from the sacred stones near the first cataract, its surface polished to mirror smoothness, and inscribed with prayers that called upon the stars to witness the restoration of a divine order. Osiris's wrapped form displayed the perfect proportions that Egyptian artists would later codify in their representations of divine and royal figures, his height measuring exactly 6 cubits according to the sacred mathematics that govern temple construction. The bandages that covered his face had been shaped to reveal the serene expression of one who had transcended death, while his hands were positioned to hold the crook and flail that symbolized his eternal authority over the afterlife. Despite the meticulous care that Isis had devoted to reassembling her husband's physical form, one crucial piece remained missing from the restoration. Set's particular malice had focused on Osiris's reproductive organs, which he had not merely hidden but had cast into the Nile waters, where the sacred fish had consumed them before they could be recovered. The loss of this essential component of masculine divine power created a fundamental obstacle to the conventional resurrection techniques that might otherwise have restored Osiris to full life and authority over the world of the living. The absence of her husband's generative capacity filled Isis with a desperation that transcended ordinary grief and approached the cosmic anguish that accompanied the disruption of fundamental natural laws. The goddess understood that without the ability to create new life, Osiris could never fully reclaim his role as the god of fertility and regeneration who had brought agricultural abundance to Egypt. More immediately, the missing organs represented the destruction of their hopes for producing an heir who could challenge Set's usurped authority and restore the legitimate dynasty to the throne of the two lands. The solution that Isis devised drew upon magical knowledge that reached back to the earliest periods of creation, when the first gods had brought forth life through acts of divine will rather than the physical procreation. The goddess began preparing for a transformation that would allow her to assume the form of a kite, one of the birds of prey whose keen eyesight and powerful wings made them symbols of divine protection and maternal vigilance. The shape-changing process required extensive ritual preparation that involved fasting, purification ceremonies, and the recitation of spells that had been old when the pyramids were young. The transformation itself took place during the darkest hour before dawn, when the boundary between night and day created conditions that favoured magical workings of exceptional power and complexity. Isis stood beside her husband's mummy as her human form began to shimmer and blur, her divine essence flowing into new configurations that reshaped bone, muscle, and sinew according to avian patterns. Her arms elongated and sprouted the brown and white feathers characteristic of the kite species, while her legs transformed into the powerful talons that would allow her to maintain her position above Osiris's prone fore. The goddess's head underwent the most dramatic alteration as her human features flowed into the sharp-beaked profile of a hunting bird, her eyes becoming the piercing golden orbs that could spot prey from impossible distances. Her hair disappeared entirely, replaced by the sleek feathers that covered her skull and neck in patterns that resembled the elaborate headdresses she had worn as Queen of Egypt. The transformation preserved her essential consciousness and magical abilities while granting her the physical capabilities necessary for the unprecedented act of conception she was about to attempt. The kite form that Isis had assumed possessed wingspan that measured nearly 8 cubits from tip to tip, dimensions that reflected her divine nature while maintaining the aerodynamic properties necessary for sustained flight. Her feathers displayed coloration that shifted between brown and gold depending on the angle of observation, creating an iridescent effect that marked her as something far more significant than any ordinary bird. The talons that had replaced her feet gleamed like polished bronze and possessed the strength to tear through stone, while her beak bore the curved sharpness that could penetrate even divine flesh if necessary. The act of hovering above Osiris's mummified form required Isis to maintain a precise position that would allow her transformed body to channel the creative forces necessary for conception, while avoiding any contact that might disturb the delicate arrangement of his restored remains. Her wings beat with a rhythm that matched the pulse of her divine heart, creating air currents that stirred the sacred incense burning around the granite bier and sent the aromatic smoke spiralling upward toward the star-filled sky. The sound of her wing beats echoed through the marsh sanctuary like a primordial drumbeat that marked the beginning of a new phase in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The magical energies that Isis channeled during her aerial vigil drew upon sources that extended far beyond her individual power to encompass the fundamental forces that had driven creation since the emergence of the first gods from the primeval waters. The goddess became a conduit for the creative principle itself, allowing the life-giving essence that permeated the universe to flow through her transformed body and into the reconstructed form of her beloved husband. The process generated emanations that caused the marsh waters to glow with phosphorescent light, while the papyrus reeds swayed in rhythms that matched her wing beats despite the absence of any natural wind. The conception that resulted from this unprecedented magical working transcended the normal biological processes that governed reproduction among both mortals and gods. Rather than requiring the physical union of male and female essences, Isis's divine will and overwhelming love for Osiris created the spark of new life through pure magical force, channeled into the precise configuration necessary for generating a child. The life force that she drew from the cosmic sources flowed into her transformed reproductive organs, where it combined with her own divine essence to begin the formation of the heir, who would eventually challenge Set's authority. The moment of successful conception announced itself through supernatural phenomena that transformed the entire marsh sanctuary into a theatre of divine manifestation. The waters surrounding the hidden island began to bubble and steam as if heated by underground fires, while pillars of golden light erupted from the depths to illuminate the night sky with radiance that rivaled the sun itself. The papyrus reeds burst into simultaneous bloom, their normally modest flowers expanding into lotus-like blossoms that glowed with their own inner light and filled the air with fragrances that evoked memories of the most sacred temple ceremonies. The wildlife that inhabited the marshland responded to the cosmic event with behavior that defied their normal patterns and instincts. Crocodiles that usually avoided each other's territory gathered in peaceful congregations around the sanctuary's perimeter, their eyes reflecting the supernatural light as they maintained silent vigil over the proceedings. Flocks of ibises and herons arrived from distant regions to circle overhead in complex patterns that resembled the hieroglyphic symbols used in the most powerful protective spells. Even the fish in the marsh waters swam in formations that created living mandalas visible from above, their movements synchronized by forces that transcended ordinary animal behavior. The transformation back to her human form left Isis physically and magically exhausted from the unprecedented effort of channeling creative forces that normally operated only during the initial phases of cosmic creation. The goddess's return to her familiar appearance proceeded more slowly than her original transformation, with each anatomical change requiring conscious effort as she guided her divine essence back into its accustomed configurations. The process left her with a profound sense of fulfillment that transcended the physical satisfaction of successful conception to encompass the spiritual completion that came from participating directly in the fundamental processes that sustained universal order. The pregnancy that resulted from this miraculous conception proceeded according to divine rather than mortal timelines, with the developing child growing at a rate that reflected his destined role as the avenger who would restore legitimate authority to the throne of Egypt. Isis could feel the life force expanding within her womb with each passing day, the divine essence of her unborn son creating emanations that strengthened her own magical abilities while also attracting the attention of supernatural forces, both benevolent and hostile. The goddess recognized that her condition would make her increasingly vulnerable to Set's agents as the pregnancy progressed, necessitating additional precautions to ensure both her safety and that of her unborn heir. The selection of Chemis as the location for her confinement and the eventual birth reflected Isis's careful analysis of the magical and strategic factors that would influence her child's survival during the dangerous period following his arrival. The marshland's isolation provided natural protection against conventional threats, while its connection to the primordial waters that had witnessed the first acts of creation would imbue the birth with cosmic significance that would enhance the child's inherent divine power. The presence of ancient temple foundations beneath the marsh waters created a sacred space that had been consecrated by generations of religious observance, adding layers of protective influence that would shield both mother and child during their most vulnerable moments. The goddess Wadjet, whose dominion over the cobra serpents that inhabited the marshlands made her a natural guardian of the sacred site, responded to Isis's presence by manifesting her protection in increasingly obvious ways. The venomous snakes that normally posed deadly threats to any intruders began gathering around the sanctuary's perimeter in configurations that created living barriers against unwanted visitors. These serpentine guardians displayed none of the aggressive behaviour typical of their species when defending territory, instead maintaining alert but peaceful vigils that suggested they were responding to divine commands rather than natural instincts. The protective measures that Wadjet implemented extended beyond the deployment of her serpentine servants to include magical workings that would conceal the sanctuary from hostile observation. The Cobra Goddess wove spells of misdirection and confusion around the marshland site that would cause Set's agents to lose their way if they attempted to approach the hidden island. These enchantments operated by subtly altering the perception of distance and direction, making the sanctuary appear to be located several miles from its actual position, while simultaneously creating the impression that the area contained nothing more significant than ordinary marsh vegetation. Additional divine allies responded to Isis's need for protection during her pregnancy by offering their own forms of assistance and support. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess whose fierce maternal instincts made her the patron of women in childbirth, established her presence in the deeper waters surrounding the sanctuary island. The massive deity's bulk remained hidden beneath the surface during daylight hours, but her vigilant eyes watched constantly for any signs of approaching danger. Her powerful jaws and crushing weight would prove devastating to any enemies foolish enough to attempt an aquatic approach to the sacred site. The god bees, whose grotesque appearance concealed benevolent intentions, focused on protecting households and newborn children, took up residence among the papyrus thickets that surrounded the sanctuary. His dwarf-like stature and lion-like features made him perfectly suited for concealment among the dense vegetation, while his knowledge of protective magic complemented the defensive measures that the other guardian deities had implemented. Bess's presence added an element of active defense to the sanctuary's protections, as his combat abilities would prove formidable against any attackers who managed to penetrate the outer barriers. The months of Isis's pregnancy passed in relative tranquility as the combined protective measures maintained the sanctuary's security against the various threats that Set's paranoia generated throughout Egypt. The usurper god's agents conducted increasingly desperate searches for any trace of his sister-wife's location, recognizing that her continued freedom represented an ongoing challenge to his authority that would eventually manifest in more direct forms of opposition. The failure of these search efforts only intensified Set's frustration and contributed to the increasingly erratic behaviour that was undermining his ability to govern the two lands effectively. The approach of the birth itself was heralded by supernatural phenomena that announced the imminent arrival of a divine heir, whose destiny would reshape the cosmic balance between order and chaos. The marsh waters began to pulse with rhythmic light that matched the contractions of Isis's labour, while the protective serpents arranged themselves in patterns that formed living hieroglyphs, spelling out names of power and protection. The papyrus reeds swayed in harmonious movements that created music without instruments, their rustling producing melodies that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of creation. The actual moment of birth took place during the hour when Ra's solar bark reached its zenith in the daily journey across the sky. timing that would imbue the newborn god with the strength and authority associated with the sun's peak power. Isis's labour proceeded without the complications that often accompanied divine births, the protective influences that surrounded the sanctuary, ensuring that both mother and child would emerge from the experience with their full power intact. The goddess's divine nature allowed her to maintain conscious awareness throughout the process, enabling her to guide the magical forces that would shape her son's emergence into the world. The infant who emerged from this miraculous birth bore the unmistakable marks of divine parentage, combined with the specific characteristics that would define his role as the avenger of his father's murder. His skin displayed the golden coloration associated with solar deities, reflecting his connection to Ra's authority and the legitimacy of pharaonic power that he would eventually claim. His eyes, even in the first moments after birth, showed the keen intelligence and fierce determination that would drive his quest to overthrow Set's usurped authority and restore Ma'at to the Two Lands. The child's physical form, though that of a newborn infant, already displayed the perfect proportions that marked him as destined for greatness among both gods and mortals. His limbs possessed the strength that would eventually wield the weapons necessary to defeat Set in combat, while his features combined the nobility of his father Osiris with the magical wisdom inherited from his mother Isis. The infant's cry, when it first rang out across the marsh sanctuary, carried tones that resonated with the fundamental harmonies underlying creation itself, announcing to the cosmos that a new champion of order had entered the eternal struggle against chaos. The name that Isis bestowed upon her son reflected both his divine heritage and his destined role in the cosmic drama that would determine Egypt's future. Horus, meaning the distant one or he who is above, acknowledged his connection to the sky god, whose falcon form soared high above the earthbound conflicts that plagued mortal existence. The name also carried implications of royal authority and divine oversight that would prove prophetic as the child grew, to challenge Set's illegitimate rule and establish his own claim to the throne of the Two Lands. The protective arrangements that the guardian deities implemented for the infant Horus's safety during his vulnerable early months reflected their understanding that Set's agents would intensify their efforts to locate and eliminate the threat that his existence represented to the usurper's authority. The scorpions that inhabited the marsh sanctuary received divine commands to serve as the child's personal guardians, their venomous stings providing deadly protection against any intruders who might attempt to harm the infant heir. These arachnid protectors arranged themselves in concentric circles around Horus's resting place, their vigilant presence ensuring that no enemy could approach without facing immediate and lethal retaliation. The serpents under Wadjet's command assumed responsibility for the sanctuary's perimeter defense, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to distinguish between legitimate visitors and potential threats with supernatural accuracy. The Cobra Goddess had imbued her servants with portions of her own divine essence, transforming them from ordinary reptiles into magical guardians, whose abilities far exceeded those of their natural counterparts. These enhanced serpents could detect hostile intentions from great distances while remaining invisible to enemies who lacked the magical sensitivity necessary to perceive their presence. The recovery of Osiris's scattered remains had been completed, yet the god's restoration to life required magical workings that transcended the conventional boundaries between existence and death. Isis stood before her husband's reassembled mummy in the hidden sanctuary of Chemmis, her hands glowing with the accumulated power of spells that had been gathering strength throughout her months of searching and preparation. The goddess had studied the most ancient texts preserved in temple libraries, consulting scrolls that contained knowledge from the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, when the distinction between life and death remained fluid and negotiable through divine intervention. The resurrection ritual that Isis prepared to perform drew upon magical traditions that predated the establishment of formal mortuary practices, reaching back to the primordial era when gods could move freely between different states of existence. The ceremony required precise timing that would align with astronomical conditions favourable to the restoration of life force, specifically the heliacal rising of the star Sopdet that mark the beginning of the annual flood cycle. This celestial event carried profound significance in Egyptian religious thought, representing the triumph of order over chaos and the renewal of life-giving forces that sustained the natural world. The goddess began her work by lighting braziers filled with incense compounds that had been prepared according to formulas revealed in the most sacred temple archives. The aromatic smoke that rose from these fires contained frankincense from the distant land of Punt, myrrh that had been aged in temple storehouses for decades, and rare resins whose procurement had required diplomatic negotiations with foreign rulers. The combination of these precious substances created fragrances that were believed to attract the attention of benevolent deities while repelling the chaotic forces that might interfere with the resurrection process. Isis positioned herself at the head of the granite bier where Osiris's mummified form lay in state, her divine senses attuned to the faint emanations of life force that still lingered within the carefully wrapped remains. The goddess could perceive the threads of consciousness that connected her husband's scattered essence to the physical form she had so painstakingly reassembled, fragile links that would need to be strengthened and reinforced through magical intervention before full restoration could be achieved. The process would require her to serve as a conduit for cosmic energies that operated according to laws that even the gods understood only partially. The opening phase of the resurrection ritual involved the recitation of spells that had been inscribed on papyrus scrolls using ink made from ground lapis lazuli mixed with gold dust. These incantations addressed each of Osiris's reassembled body parts individually, calling upon the divine essence that resided within them to respond to Isis's commands and begin the process of reintegration. The goddess's voice carried across the marsh sanctuary with tones that seemed to resonate with the fundamental harmonies underlying creation itself, her words creating vibrations that penetrated the mummy wrappings to reach the preserved flesh beneath. The first signs of the ritual's effectiveness manifested as subtle changes in the atmosphere surrounding the granite bier, with the air itself beginning to shimmer with barely visible emanations that suggested the presence of supernatural forces. The incense smoke that had been rising in straight columns began to swirl in complex patterns that resembled hieroglyphic symbols, while the marsh waters surrounding the sanctuary island started to pulse with phosphorescent light that matched the rhythm of Isis's incantations. These phenomena indicated that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was beginning to thin in response to the goddess's magical workings. The critical moment of the resurrection ritual arrived when Isis performed the ancient ceremony known as the opening of the mouth, a procedure that would restore Osiris's ability to speak, breathe, and consume the offerings necessary to sustain divine existence. The goddess used ritual implements that had been crafted specifically for this purpose, including an adze made from meteoric iron that had fallen from the sky during the reign of the first pharaohs. The metal's celestial origin imbued it with properties that could penetrate the barriers between different states of existence, making it an ideal tool for the delicate work of reactivating dormant life functions. The opening of the mouth ceremony required Isis to touch specific points on Osiris's wrapped head with the meteoric adze while reciting formulas that would command his facial features to resume their vital functions. Each touch of the iron tool against the linen bandages created sparks of golden light that penetrated through the wrappings to reach the preserved flesh beneath, reactivating neural pathways that had been dormant since the moment of his death. The process proceeded methodically, with separate incantations for the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears that would restore their capacity to perceive and interact with the physical world. The restoration of Osiris's consciousness occurred gradually, beginning with subtle movements beneath the mummy wrappings that indicated the return of voluntary muscle control. The god's fingers, which had remained motionless since Isis had positioned them, to hold the crook and flail of pharaonic authority, began to flex with increasing strength as divine life force flowed back into the preserved tissues. His breathing, initially so shallow as to be barely perceptible, deepened into the regular rhythm that characterized living beings, while his heartbeat resumed the steady pulse that would circulate renewed vitality throughout his restored form. The moment when Osiris's eyes opened for the first time since his murder created an emotional impact that transcended the purely physical aspects of his resurrection. The god's gaze, though still filtered through the linen bandages that covered his face, carried the unmistakable intelligence and awareness that marked him as fully conscious and capable of comprehending his situation. His recognition of Isis, evident in the subtle movements of his head as he turned toward her voice, confirmed that the resurrection had successfully restored not only his physical functions, but also his memories and emotional connections to the world he had left behind. The communication that passed between the reunited divine couple required no spoken words, as their shared consciousness allowed them to exchange thoughts and feelings through direct mental contact. Osiris expressed his profound gratitude for Isis's devotion and the incredible sacrifices she had made to restore him to life, while also conveying his understanding of the cosmic changes that had occurred during his absence from the world of the living. The god's awareness extended beyond his personal situation to encompass the broader implications of his death and resurrection for the eternal struggle between order and chaos that governed universal existence. The choice that Osiris faced upon his return to consciousness represented one of the most significant decisions in the history of divine existence, with implications that would reshape the fundamental structure of reality itself. The god possessed the power to reclaim his position as Pharaoh of Egypt and ruler of the living world, using his restored authority to overthrow Set's usurped regime and restore the natural order that had been disrupted by his murder. This option would satisfy the demands of justice and provide immediate relief for the suffering that Egypt's population had endured under Set's chaotic rule. However, Osiris's expanded awareness, gained through his experience of death and the journey through the shadowy realms that lay beyond mortal existence, revealed an alternative path that would serve the greater cosmic good more effectively than simple restoration of the previous order. The god had witnessed the confusion and terror that death brought to mortal beings who lacked the knowledge and preparation necessary to navigate the afterlife successfully. Their souls wandered lost and frightened through the dark regions that lay beyond the physical world, vulnerable to the predatory entities and chaotic forces that sought to devour or corrupt them. The decision that Osiris reached reflected his fundamental nature as a deity whose primary concern focused on the welfare of all beings rather than his own personal desires for revenge or restored authority. The god chose to abandon his claim to rule over the world of the living, recognizing that his unique experience of death and resurrection had prepared him for a far more important role as the sovereign of the afterlife realm. This sacrifice would allow him to establish order and justice in the domain of the dead, providing the guidance and protection that departed souls desperately needed to achieve successful transition to eternal existence. The transformation that accompanied Osiris's acceptance of his new cosmic role began immediately, with changes that affected both his physical appearance and his fundamental nature as a divine being. The green coloration that had marked him as a fertility god associated with the living world began to deepen into the darker hues that would identify him with the mysteries of death and rebirth. His skin took on the characteristic black-green colour that Egyptian artists would later use to depict him in tomb paintings and temple reliefs, a pigmentation that symbolized the fertile soil of the Nile Valley after the floodwaters had receded and the cycle of agricultural renewal could begin. The regalia that materialized around Osiris's transformed form reflected his new status as ruler of the Underworld rather than Pharaoh of Egypt. The traditional crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt that had symbolized his earthly authority were replaced by the Atef crown, an elaborate headdress that combined the white crown of Upper Egypt with ostrich feathers representing truth and justice. The crook and flail that appeared in his wrapped hands retained their basic forms, but acquired new significance as symbols of his authority over the souls of the dead rather than the living population of the two lands. The establishment of the Duat, the underworld realm that would serve as Osiris's eternal kingdom, required the god to exercise creative powers that drew upon the fundamental forces that had shaped the universe during the initial phases of creation. The realm that emerged from his divine will possessed characteristics that reflected both the needs of departed souls and the cosmic principles that governed the afterlife journey. The Duat existed parallel to the physical world but remained separated from it by barriers that could only be crossed through the process of death or through exceptional magical intervention. The geography of the underworld that Osiris created combined elements familiar from the Egyptian landscape with supernatural features that reflected the unique requirements of the afterlife realm. The domain contained a river that paralleled the Nile's course through Egypt, providing a pathway that departed souls could follow as they journeyed toward their final judgment. The riverbanks were lined with fields of reeds that resembled the marshlands where Isis had given birth to Horus, creating familiar environments that would comfort souls, making the difficult transition from earthly to eternal existence. The architectural features that Osiris established within the Duat included massive halls where the judgment of the dead would take place, their dimensions calculated according to the sacred mathematics that governed temple construction in the world above. The walls of these chambers were decorated with hieroglyphic texts that provided guidance for souls navigating the complex procedures required for successful passage to eternal life. The inscriptions included maps of the underworld's various regions, lists of the protective spells that would ward off hostile entities, and detailed descriptions of the moral standards that would determine each soul's ultimate fate. The most significant structure within Osiris's underworld kingdom was the Hall of Two Truths, where the god would preside over the weighing of hearts that determined whether departed souls deserved admission to eternal paradise or faced destruction for their moral failures. The hall's design incorporated architectural elements that symbolized the cosmic principles governing divine justice, with columns carved to resemble the pillars that supported the sky and a ceiling painted to mirror the star patterns that guided souls through their afterlife journey. The chamber's focal point was a massive balance scale, whose construction required materials that could accurately measure the weight of human hearts against the feather of Ma'at. The goddess Ma'at, whose feather served as the standard against which all moral behaviour would be judged, accepted Osiris's invitation to serve as his partner in administering divine justice within the underworld realm. Her presence ensured that the judgment process would operate according to the fundamental principles of truth and righteousness that had governed Egyptian civilization since its earliest periods. The goddess's feather, when placed on the balance scale opposite a deceased person's heart, would reveal through its weight whether that individual had lived according to the moral standards required for eternal life. The procedures that Osiris established for judging the dead reflected both his understanding of human nature and his commitment to ensuring that divine justice operated fairly for all souls, regardless of their earthly status or circumstances. Each departed soul would be required to recite the negative confession, a detailed declaration that listed the various sins and moral failures they claimed not to have committed during their lifetime. This recitation served both as a test of the soul's honesty and as a reminder of the ethical standards that governed proper behaviour in both earthly and eternal existence. The weighing of hearts that followed the negative confession represented the climactic moment of each soul's judgment, determining whether they would gain admission to the blessed fields of the afterlife or face the terrible fate of being devoured by Amit, the composite demon whose crocodile head, lion's torso, and hippopotamus hindquarters made her capable of completely destroying souls that failed to meet divine standards. The balance scale's verdict was absolute and irreversible, reflecting the cosmic law that moral choices made during earthly existence carried consequences that extended into eternity. Souls whose hearts proved lighter than Maat's feather, indicating lives lived in accordance with divine principles, gained admission to the field of reeds, a paradise that resembled the most fertile regions of Egypt, but enhanced with supernatural abundance that eliminated all suffering and want. These blessed spirits would spend eternity in perfect happiness, engaging in the agricultural activities they had known in life, but without the hardships of disease, famine, or social conflict that had marked their earthly existence. The paradise that Osiris created for the righteous dead provided everything necessary for eternal contentment, while maintaining the cultural patterns and social relationships that had given meaning to their mortal lives. The establishment of proper burial practices that would ensure successful passage through the afterlife judgment became one of Osiris's primary concerns as ruler of the Underworld. The god revealed to the living world the specific procedures that would prepare bodies and souls for their journey through the Duat, including the mummification techniques that would preserve physical forms and the magical spells that would provide protection against the dangers encountered during the afterlife voyage. These practices, when performed correctly, would guarantee that even ordinary mortals could achieve the same resurrection that Osiris himself had experienced through Isis's devotion and magical skill. The promise of resurrection and eternal life that Osiris offered to all who followed proper burial practices represented a revolutionary development in Egyptian religious thought, extending the possibility of divine existence beyond the royal family and priesthood to include every individual who lived according to moral principles. This democratization of the afterlife created powerful incentives for ethical behavior, while also providing comfort to those facing the inevitability of death. The knowledge that proper preparation could ensure reunion with deceased family members in a paradise free from earthly suffering transformed death from a terrifying unknown into a transition that could be anticipated with hope rather than dread. The influence that Osiris's underworld kingdom exerted upon the world of the living manifested through the annual flood cycle that continued to bring fertility to Egypt despite his physical absence from the earthly realm. The god's connection to the agricultural processes that sustained human civilization persisted through his role as judge of the dead, as souls who achieved successful resurrection in the afterlife contributed their spiritual energy to maintaining the natural cycles that supported life in the physical world. This cosmic arrangement ensured that the moral behavior of the living population would directly affect the prosperity and abundance that Egypt enjoyed from the Nile's life-giving waters. The priests who served in temples dedicated to Osiris throughout Egypt became the primary intermediaries between the god's underworld kingdom and the needs of the living population. These religious specialists learned the complex rituals and magical procedures necessary to communicate with the realm of the dead, providing guidance to families preparing for funerals and offering prayers that would ensure the successful transition of departed souls to eternal existence. The priesthood's knowledge of afterlife procedures made them essential advisors for anyone seeking to guarantee their own resurrection or that of their deceased relatives. The mortuary temples that were constructed to honour Osiris and facilitate communication with his underworld realm became centres of religious activity that attracted pilgrims from throughout Egypt and beyond. These sacred complexes provided facilities for the mummification procedures that prepared bodies for burial, libraries containing the texts necessary for proper funeral ceremonies, and workshops where craftsmen created the amulets, canopic jars, and other ritual objects required for successful afterlife preparation. The temples also served as training centres where aspiring priests could learn the specialised knowledge necessary to serve as intermediaries between the living and the dead. The transformation of Osiris from murdered victim to supreme judge of the afterlife established patterns of death and resurrection that would influence Egyptian religious thought for millennia to come. The god's voluntary acceptance of his role as ruler of the underworld demonstrated that apparent defeat could be transformed into ultimate victory through adherence to divine principles and willingness to serve the greater cosmic good. This example provided inspiration for countless individuals facing their own mortality, while also establishing the theological framework that would govern Egyptian funeral practices and afterlife beliefs throughout the remainder of the civilization's long history. The transformation of Osiris from murdered pharaoh to supreme judge of the afterlife established the foundation for religious practices that would define Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years. His resurrection and ascension to rule the underworld created a divine precedent that promised eternal life to all who followed proper burial procedures and lived according to the moral principles embodied in Ma'at. This revolutionary concept transformed death from a terrifying finality into a transition that could be navigated successfully through careful preparation and righteous behaviour, fundamentally altering how Egyptians understood their relationship with mortality and the divine realm. The annual festivals celebrating Osiris's death and resurrection became the most significant religious observances in the Egyptian calendar, drawing participants from every level of society who sought to connect their own mortality with the god's promise of eternal life. The most elaborate of these celebrations took place at Byblos, the sacred city in Upper Egypt that housed Osiris's primary cult centre and served as the destination for pilgrims seeking the god's blessing upon their own eventual journey to the afterlife. The festival season began during the month of Khoiak, when the Nile's floodwaters had receded sufficiently to allow large crowds to gather in the temple complexes without risk from the river's seasonal variations. The mysteries of Osiris performed at Abydos recreated the entire cycle of the god's murder, dismemberment, and resurrection through elaborate theatrical presentations that combined religious ceremony with dramatic spectacle. These performances required months of preparation, as priests and temple personnel rehearsed the complex sequences of ritual actions that would bring the mythic events to life for assembled worshippers. The mystery plays began with scenes depicting Osiris's golden age as pharaoh of Egypt, showing actors portraying the god teaching agriculture and establishing the laws that governed civilized society. These opening sequences emphasized the prosperity and order that had characterized his reign, creating a stark contrast with the violence and chaos that would follow. The dramatic recreation of Set's conspiracy and the murder at Memphis required exceptional theatrical skill to convey the horror of divine fratricide, while maintaining the religious solemnity appropriate to sacred ceremony. Actors wearing elaborate masks and costumes representing the 72 conspirators moved through carefully choreographed sequences that depicted the feast, the presentation of the sarcophagus, and the moment when the trap was sprung. The audience's emotional response to these scenes was intense and immediate, with many participants weeping openly as they witnessed the symbolic death of the god who promised their own resurrection. The most sacred portions of the Abydos mysteries took place within the temple's inner sanctuaries, where only the highest-ranking priests and specially purified initiates were permitted to observe the rituals that recreated Isis's quest to recover her husband's scattered remains. These ceremonies involved the manipulation of sacred objects that represented Osiris's dismembered body parts, with each piece being carried through specific routes within the temple complex that symbolized the goddess's journey across Egypt. The priests who participated in these rituals underwent extensive purification procedures that included fasting, ritual bathing, and the recitation of protective spells that would shield them from the dangerous spiritual forces unleashed during the reenactment of divine events. The climactic resurrection sequence required the most skilled ritual specialists to perform magical workings that would symbolically restore Osiris to life, while maintaining the boundary between ceremonial representation and actual divine manifestation. The temple's most sacred chamber contained a golden statue of the god that had been crafted according to precise specifications revealed in ancient texts, its proportions calculated to serve as a suitable vessel for receiving Osiris's spiritual presence during the festival ceremonies. the statue's activation through ritual procedures created emanations that participants could perceive as evidence of the god's actual presence among them, transforming the theatrical performance into authentic religious experience. The public portions of the Byblos festival included processions that allowed ordinary worshippers to participate in honouring Osiris, while witnessing abbreviated versions of the mysteries that were performed in full only within the temple's restricted areas. These processions followed routes that had been established during the earliest periods of the cult's development, winding through the city's streets and ending at sacred sites where participants could offer prayers and leave votive offerings. The processional routes were lined with temporary altars where priests performed abbreviated ritual sequences, allowing the crowds to observe symbolic representations of the key events in Osiris's mythic cycle. The festival's economic impact on Byblos and the surrounding region was enormous, as thousands of pilgrims required food, lodging and transportation during their visits to the sacred city. Local merchants and craftsmen prepared for months in advance, stockpiling the goods and services that would be in high demand during the festival season. The production of religious souvenirs, including small statues of Osiris, amulets bearing his image, and papyrus scrolls containing prayers and spells associated with his cult, became a major industry that supported numerous workshops and provided employment for skilled artisans throughout the region. The identification of deceased pharaohs with Osiris and living rulers with Horus created the theological framework that legitimized Egyptian kingship and provided continuity across dynastic changes that might otherwise have disrupted the political order. This divine cycle ensured that each pharaoh's death was understood not as the end of royal authority, but as a transformation that elevated the deceased ruler to divine status while simultaneously transferring legitimate power to his successor. The living pharaoh ruled as the earthly manifestation of Horus, wielding authority that derived directly from his identification with the god who had successfully challenged Set's usurped power and restored Maat to the two lands. The coronation ceremonies that installed new pharaohs incorporated elaborate rituals that formally established their identification with Horus, while acknowledging their eventual transformation into Osiris upon death. These procedures require the participation of priests from throughout Egypt, who would witness the divine investiture and carry news of the successful transition to their local communities. The new ruler received the traditional regalia of pharaonic authority, including the crook and flail that Osiris had first wielded, the double crown that symbolized dominion over both Upper and Lower Egypt, and the false beard that marked him as a living god worthy of worship and obedience. The royal burial practices that developed around the Osiris cult created some of the most elaborate mortuary complexes in human history, as pharaohs invested enormous resources in ensuring their successful transformation from living Horus to deceased Osiris. The construction of pyramid complexes during the Old Kingdom represented the pinnacle of these efforts, with massive stone monuments serving as eternal palaces where the dead pharaohs could continue exercising divine authority in their transformed state. The internal chambers of these monuments contained everything necessary for the ruler's afterlife existence, including food offerings, precious objects, and detailed instructions for navigating the underworld journey that would culminate in judgment before Osiris's tribunal. The mortuary temples associated with royal burial sites served as perpetual centres for the cults that maintained the deceased pharaoh's divine status and ensured their continued influence over earthly affairs. These complexes required permanent staffs of priests who performed daily rituals that sustained the dead ruler's spiritual existence, while also providing intermediary services for living Egyptians seeking divine intervention in their personal affairs. The economic resources devoted to maintaining these mortuary cults represented a significant portion of Egypt's total wealth, demonstrating the central importance of the Osiris mythology in Egyptian religious and political thought. The spread of Osiris worship throughout Egypt occurred gradually as local communities adapted the god's mythology to incorporate existing religious traditions and address regional concerns. The major cult centres that emerged at Abydos, Philae and Memphis each developed distinctive characteristics that reflected their particular geographical and cultural contexts, while maintaining the essential elements of Osiris's story and significance. Abydos, located in Upper Egypt near the traditional burial grounds of the earliest pharaohs, became the primary destination for pilgrims seeking to ensure their own resurrection through association with the god's sacred site. The temple complex at Abydos grew over centuries of continuous construction and renovation, as successive pharaohs added new buildings and enhanced existing structures to accommodate the increasing numbers of pilgrims who visited the sacred city. The site's most impressive monument was the mortuary temple built by Seti, first during the 19th dynasty, a massive stone complex that contained detailed reliefs depicting the complete Osiris mythology alongside representations of the pharaoh's own identification with the god. The temple's design incorporated architectural innovations that enhance the acoustic properties of ritual chambers, allowing the chanted prayers and hymns performed during ceremonies to create resonant effects that participants interpreted as evidence of divine presence. The island temple of Philae, located in the Nile near the First Cataract, became particularly associated with the myth of Isis's search for Osiris's scattered remains and her successful resurrection of her murdered husband. The temple's position surrounded by the river's rushing waters created a natural sanctuary that pilgrims could reach only by boat, adding an element of pilgrimage journey that enhanced the spiritual significance of their visit. The priests of Philae developed specialized rituals that recreated Isis's magical workings, offering healing services and fertility blessings that attracted visitors from throughout the ancient world. The Memphis cult center focused on Osiris's role as the divine pharaoh, whose murder had disrupted the natural order and whose resurrection had established the promise of eternal life for all righteous individuals. The temple complex at Memphis contained extensive facilities for mummification and burial preparation, serving as a training center where mortuary priests learned the techniques necessary for ensuring successful afterlife transitions. The site's proximity to the royal necropolis at Saqqara made it a natural gathering place for funeral processions and memorial ceremonies that honoured deceased members of the royal family and nobility. The pilgrimage routes that connected these major cult centres created networks of religious travel that facilitated the exchange of ideas and practices among different regions of Egypt. Pilgrims travelling between Abydos, Philae and Memphis would stop at smaller shrines and temples along their routes, contributing to the spread of Osiris worship while also supporting local economies through their need for food, lodging and religious services. These pilgrimage networks helped maintain cultural unity across Egypt's vast territory by providing shared religious experiences that transcended regional differences and political boundaries. The democratization of afterlife beliefs that resulted from Osiris worship transformed Egyptian society by extending the promise of resurrection beyond the royal family to include all individuals who could afford proper burial procedures and lived according to moral principles. This development created new social expectations regarding ethical behaviour, while also generating enormous demand for mortuary services that supported entire industries devoted to mummification, tomb construction, and funeral ceremonies. The production of canopic jars, sarcophagi, amulets, and other burial goods became major economic activities that employed thousands of skilled craftsmen and generated substantial wealth for the communities where these industries were concentrated. The magical texts and spells associated with Osiris worship were compiled into collections that became essential resources for anyone seeking to ensure successful passage through the afterlife journey. The most famous of these compilations, known as the Book of the Dead, contained hundreds of spells and instructions that would guide souls through the various challenges they would encounter in the underworld. These texts were copied onto papyrus scrolls that were placed in tombs alongside mummified bodies, providing the deceased with the knowledge necessary to navigate the complex procedures required for resurrection and eternal life. The artistic traditions that developed around Osiris worship created distinctive iconographic conventions that influenced Egyptian visual culture for millennia. The god's characteristic appearance, with his green or black skin, mummiform body, and regalia of crook and flail, became instantly recognizable throughout the ancient world as a symbol of death and resurrection. The artistic depictions of his mythology found in tomb paintings, temple reliefs, and illustrated papyri established narrative conventions that influenced how Egyptians understood and represented divine activities and mythological events. The influence of Osiris worship extended beyond Egypt's borders through trade relationships and diplomatic contacts that brought foreign visitors into contact with Egyptian religious practices. The mystery religions that developed in the Hellenistic and Roman periods drew heavily upon Osirian themes of death and resurrection, adapting these concepts to address the spiritual needs of diverse populations throughout the Mediterranean world. The cult of Isis in particular spread widely throughout the Roman Empire, carrying with it modified versions of the Osiris mythology that emphasized the goddess's magical powers and her promise of salvation for devoted worshippers. The enduring influence of the Osiris myth on Egyptian concepts of death, resurrection, and the afterlife sustained Egyptian civilization through political upheavals, foreign conquests, and cultural changes that might otherwise have destroyed the continuity of religious belief and practice. The promise of eternal life that Osiris offered provided psychological comfort that helped Egyptians cope with the inevitability of death, while also creating powerful incentives for moral behavior and social cooperation. The god's role as judge of the dead established ethical standards that influenced legal systems and social norms throughout Egyptian history. The theological concepts developed around Osiris worship contributed to humanity's earliest systematic attempts to understand the relationship between mortality and immortality, individual existence and cosmic order, moral behavior and spiritual consequences. The sophisticated mythology that grew around his death and resurrection addressed fundamental questions about the nature of divine justice, the possibility of life after death, and the moral responsibilities that accompany conscious existence. These themes would continue to influence religious thought long after the decline of Egyptian civilization, contributing to the development of monotheistic traditions that incorporated similar concepts of divine judgment, moral accountability, and promised resurrection. The archaeological evidence for Osiris worship, preserved in temples, tombs, and artifacts scattered throughout Egypt and beyond, provides tangible proof of the profound impact that this mythology had on ancient peoples and their understanding of existence itself. The massive resources devoted to constructing monuments, creating artwork, and maintaining religious institutions dedicated to the god demonstrate the central importance of his cult in Egyptian society. The survival of these physical remains allows modern scholars to reconstruct the beliefs and practices that sustained one of humanity's longest-lived civilizations, revealing the enduring power of mythological narratives to provide meaning and purpose in the face of mortality's universal challenge. The legacy of Osiris as the dying and rising god established archetypal patterns that would resonate through subsequent religious traditions, influencing concepts of divine sacrifice, redemptive suffering, and promised resurrection that continue to shape human spiritual understanding. His transformation from murdered victim to supreme judge of the afterlife demonstrated that apparent defeat could become ultimate victory through adherence to divine principles and willingness to serve the greater cosmic good. This profound message, embedded within the complex mythology that surrounded his death and resurrection, provided inspiration and comfort to countless individuals across more than 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, establishing Osiris as one of history's most enduring and influential divine figures, whose promise of eternal life continues to echo in humanity's ongoing quest to transcend the limitations of mortal existence.